Welcome to a special edition of COS Live. I'm Rita Peters, the Senior Vice President for Legislative Affairs with Convention of States Action. And this is our first of these special live broadcasts in the new year. The first committee hearing of the year goes to, can you guess which state? It's Montana. In just a few minutes, we are expecting a Montana Senate Committee on Business, Labor, and Economic Affairs in consideration of our Article 5 Convention of States legislation. You will hear it referred to as SJ2. It's Senate Joint Resolution 2. Former U.S. Senator and current Convention of States Action Senior Advisor Rick Santorum is on hand to testify in favor of our Article 5 application. He is no doubt in the committee room and getting ready right now for the hearing that's about to happen. So let's give you a little background before it kicks off here. 19 states have already passed our resolution calling for an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments to the U.S. Constitution on 3 topics: fiscal restraints, term limits, and limits on federal scope and jurisdiction. And producer G is showing you the map there of the states that have already passed our resolution. We need 34 states to get to convention. So just 15 to go to call the first ever Article 5 convention. And I have to say, it is high time the states use this process to get the federal government back in its constitutional box. This year, our resolution is expected to be considered by about 20 additional states, including, of course, Montana. Currently, we have 7 states where our resolution has already been introduced: Iowa, Massachusetts, of all places, Montana, New Hampshire, New York, Virginia, and Wyoming all have active legislation pending that's based on our model resolution, limited to those 3 subject matters that I mentioned earlier. So let's review how we got to this point. The Convention of States Montana volunteer team has been busy building support across the state and in the legislature. Over 16,000 Montanans, that's a lot of people in Montana, have already signed the Convention of States petition asking their state legislators to vote yes for COS. Because when it comes to Article 5, the power is in the hands of the state legislatures. Governor has nothing to do with it. It's the state legislature that has to call for an Article 5 convention to propose amendments. Our resolution in Montana has been championed by a true champion, Senator Tom McGilvery. He has hosted several, I would say probably dozens of town hall meetings across the state over the past couple of years. He's using his own time and energy and even finances in order to support this effort because he believes so strongly in this solution gifted to the states by the founding fathers in order to save our republic. Hundreds of local citizens have shown up to these Convention of States town halls, sometimes headlined by COS Action Senior Advisor Rick Santorum or Article 5 scholar Robert Nadelson, Professor Nadelson. And again, Rick Santorum is expected to testify today. So in just a few minutes, when this committee hearing kicks off, we are going to be showing you the committee hearing right here on COS Live. You'll get to watch the whole thing. If we have a successful vote today in committee, our Article 5 resolution would then be sent to the full Montana Senate. And if we have a successful vote there on the floor of the Montana Senate, it would still need to go through the House in Montana for final passage. But a successful vote today is that critical first step forward in the legislative process in Montana. And again, this is our first committee hearing in the country. So it's a historic moment today I'm excited to be able to bring this to you. What a great thing technology is when it enables us to be better, more informed, self governing citizens and actually sit and watch the legislative process play out without even leaving our homes. It's an amazing thing. Now, I want you to stay tuned after the vote if you can, because we will have a recap and we will hopefully get live reaction from Convention of States Action Senior Regional Director David Schneider. Montana is one of the states in his region. So I'm really excited to see what plays out today. I have not yet seen any footage of the committee room. I am told that we might have grassroots supporters there, maybe wearing their COS buttons. I love seeing that, but I don't know yet. I haven't talked to Senator Santorum yet this morning, so I don't know what the situation is looking like in the committee room, but we are going to find out. The broadcast is scheduled to begin in just a little over a minute. So stay tuned. Now, I mentioned earlier that 19 states have already passed the resolution. So you might be wondering, well, which states have passed it? Let me just give you that list: Georgia, Alaska, Alabama, Florida, Indiana, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Tennessee, North Dakota, Arizona, Missouri, Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Utah, Nebraska, Wisconsin, West Virginia, and South Carolina. We passed in those last 4 states just last year. Was a banner year for Convention of States. And people are starting to get the message. Legislators are starting to listen to their constituents, and polling reveals that a supermajority of voters support Convention of States. Thanks for that graphic. Let's go now to the committee hearing in Montana.
All right, good morning. It's a pleasure to see everybody. This will be the opening for Senate Business and Labor and the hearing on Senate Joint Resolution number 2. Secretary, could you please take roll?
Senator Curdy?
Here.
Senator Fitzpatrick?
Excused.
President Ellsworth?
Excused.
Senator Fox?
Here.
Senator Gillespie?
Here.
Senator Noland?
Here.
Senator Pope?
Here.
Senator Sales?
Here.
Senator Vermeer?
Here.
Chairman Small?
Here. All righty, thank you. So first things first, everybody that showed up here today, if you plan on speaking, if you're an opponent, I want you to sign the paperwork out front as an opponent. And if you're a proponent, same deal, informational witnesses. Everybody that speaks, I want you to make sure you are signed in at the front, in front of the doors. Next off, cell phones. Please turn your phones off. I don't want to hear them. That gets pretty aggravating. And then lastly, remember that everything you say at that podium is public record. And with that being said, Senator McGilvery, would you start on Senate Joint Resolution 2?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, Tom McGilvray, Senate District 23. That's spelled M-C-G-I-L-L-V-R-A-Y. Members, I'll be a little bit hard on Congress today, and actually I was going to tell a joke about the skunks that represent us in Congress, but it stinks, so I'm going to skip it. So, some have asked me why this bill is in Business, Labor, and Economic Affairs. And I say this without hyperbole. This bill is here because I believe this bill, or this resolution, an application under Article 5 of the United States Constitution, is about the economic survival of America. And I also believe that this committee has the wherewithal, the intelligence, the understanding of economic affairs, business issues, that they can grasp the gravity of the situation that stands before us today. So I want to, first of all, just look at SJ2 and actually what does it say. And the guts of this resolution starts on line 22 of your resolution. It says, the legislature of the state of Montana hereby applies to Congress under the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States of a convention of the states limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States that impose fiscal restraint on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and members of Congress. So the first thing we note about this application, it is, first of all, a limited application, limited to 3 subjects: to impose fiscal restraint, limit the federal government's power and jurisdiction, and limit the terms that officials and members of Congress can serve. Briefly, I was an opponent of Article 5 Convention of States for proposing amendments for some time. And actually in 2007, check the record, Representative Rick Jorb brought a resolution to rescind all Article 5 application, and I voted for that resolution. But one day, a constituent came to me about 3 years ago now, and asked if I would sit down with him for tea. I'm always open to talking to constituents. So I sat down with him, and he asked me that day what I knew about Convention of States. I said, I don't know a ton about it. Historically, I've been opposed. But he asked me if I would look into it and get back to him. That I did. And at that day, I made a promise to him. Whenever I make a promise, it's a sacred oath that I will do what I said. And so I honestly and sincerely looked at the material that he gave me, and that's when I went down the rabbit hole, if you will, to look at what it was about, began to read books on this subject, particularly Professor Nadelson's The Law of Article 5. I didn't just read the book, I read the footnotes to the book, I read all the references in there. I began to search the records of opponents and look into the original documentation of those opponents, and came to the conclusion, an epiphany, if you will, that the state legislature is given a federal function to oppose the federal government, to be a check on its power when they are out of control. I had the epiphany that it was my obligation and my responsibility to address federal power in this Capitol. And so I dedicated myself to that cause, as many of you know. I'm bringing SJ2 because Congress has saddled our children, our grandchildren, our posterity with debt that they can never repay. They are about destroying the economic foundations of America. Congress has taken on imperial powers, and they are encouraging and abetting in the destruction of this great nation. They are unsympathetic to the people that they have pledged to represent. That's why I bring you SJ2. The history of nations tells us that great nations rise and great nations fall. Germany, under Count Otto von Bismarck, rose to the epitome of economic and technological power and success in the late 18th century, second only to the United States. Yet wars, warmongering, and after the war, debt reparations, a debt-financed entitlement state took their currency from 5 marks to the dollar in about 1914 to 4 trillion marks to the dollar by 1923. From 22 to 23, it went from about 160 marks to the dollar to 4 trillion in 1 year. So the collapse, although the cracks in the foundation were there, the collapse happened rapidly. Ancient Rome, you know, lasted over 1,000 years, but again, a warring empire expanded too large to support. Moral decay, the debasement of their currency led to their collapse. If you look at ancient Israel under King Solomon and David, one of the arguably most wealthy nations in the history of mankind, yet because of moral decay, heavy taxation, economic stupidity, they became a nation where the prophet said in the final day before they were dragged off to captivity that there was no remedy. There is remedy for this country, and that remedy lies in Article 5. Let's look at briefly what Article 5 says, because I don't think that a lot of us have read it thoroughly and really looked at what the text says. Congress, this is Article 5 of the United States Constitution, Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by conventions in 3/4 of the states, whichever mode Congress will choose. So the first thing we know about Article 5 is it says there are 2 ways to propose amendments. Congress can propose. All 27 of our amendments have come from this mode. Congress proposed, states ratified. All 26 amendments were ratified in places like this, in our houses, and 1 was ratified, the repeal of prohibition, by the state conventions. So we have 2 proposal processes. The convention is a convention to propose amendments to this Constitution. This is not a constitutional convention. This is a proposal convention with authority under this application, which has been passed by 19 states, with authority to propose amendments to this Constitution. And those amendments are valid parts of that Constitution only when ratified by 3/4 of the states. And let me say this, you have to have 3/4 to ratify. Some opponents to this resolution will say that, oh, this convention can choose any method of ratification that they wish. Untrue. Multiple cases. U.S. v. Sprague, 1931, Hawk v. Smith, 1920. Other cases have specifically said that you must have 3/4 according to Article 5. There's no way you can change a ratification method. You have to have 3/4 of the states. Let me just take you back briefly to how we got Article 5's text as it is today. So on September 15th, 1787, George Mason, an ardent anti-federalist and opponent of this Constitution, stood up and said, "The method that we have to propose amendments is exceptional and dangerous." And he said that because both proposal methods ultimately rested with Congress. So in other words, what the first draft of Article 5 was is that Congress would propose whatever 2/3 of both houses thought it necessary, and then the states could put in an application, but then Congress would propose under the state's application. So in both modes, Congress ultimately controlled it. So they revised Article 5 to our current text. So the whole point of the text that we have in Article 5 today is that to put a check on federal power. Mason said that there will be a time when Congress would become oppressive. Those are his words. You might want to wonder that if he was quite prescient, that he saw what we see today, which is staggering. So Article 5 is a check on federal power. It's consistent with the checks and balances we find throughout the Constitution. It's the state legislators' obligation, responsibility, duty under Article 5 when we see federal power run amok, when we see dysfunction in federal government, it is our duty to propose amendments under Article 5. Article 5, Convention to propose amendments, is the primary check on federal power. The reserve powers given to the states, and I'll go into that later in my close, the federal government has made a mockery of our reserve powers. When we're given duty and authority, it is our duty as state legislators to act. I want you to consider a couple things. The Parkland school shooting. The police, the resource officer had the power and the authority to go in, but the headline says the resource officer did not go in. It was a dereliction of his duty. Uvalde, the same situation. The police had the duty and the power, the authority to go in and stop it, but the headline was the police failed to go in. It is a dereliction of our duty. What are we going to say if this country collapses? What's our excuse? That we didn't turn in our application? We have a moral and a constitutional duty to act. Hamilton said it best in Federalist 85, and the opponents will always say that the only amendments you can bring are ones that deal with defects. Let me say that the founders and the framers talked a lot more than defects. And I'll just read to you Hamilton's quote. He said, "By the 5th article of the plan, Congress, on the applications of 2/3 of the state legislatures, Congress will call a convention for proposing amendments. We can safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachment of the national authority. The federal government has encroached on our affairs. It is our duty under Article 5 to push back." Over 60 years now, there's been opponents of this resolution saying we just need to use Article 6, hold our legislators accountable. But let me ask you, let me just say this, it has gotten worse and worse and worse. It is time for us to act. It is our power, it is our duty to act. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'll sit down and let proponents and opponents speak. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opening. Ladies and gentlemen, we have over 50 people that will be speaking on this bill today to the subject matter. And for reasons of brevity, obviously many people are going to be saying the same thing over and over again. So I want to start this with the proponent, and I would like to give the first proponent 5 minutes, just due to the fact that they came in from a long ways away. Then after that, we will cut testimony to 3 minutes. Each person will be able to speak for 3 minutes, but I would appreciate it if you're a me too, go ahead and say me too. Don't stretch it out, try not to repeat, and try not to read everything that you brought. Thank you. Can we get our first proponent?
Thank you, Senator. It is an honored to be here before this committee. I'm Rick Santorum. I'm a former senator from Pennsylvania, former member of Congress from Pennsylvania, ran for president a couple of times. Didn't have the pleasure of running here in the state of Montana. You guys have a late primary, unfortunately, so I didn't get the chance to enjoy your state. But I'm here as someone from Washington, D.C., who knows that town pretty well, just to assure you of one thing. Washington is incapable of fixing itself. It's not that it doesn't want to. It's not that there aren't good people down there. There are a lot of good people. You may hear today that, oh, we just need to elect good people. There are a lot of good people on both sides of the aisle who really care and love this country. Don't doubt that. But the system is broken. And what do I mean by that? The founders created a system in our Constitution that worked and worked well, but it has systematically been changed. People went around and say, well, all we have to do, and they hold up their pocket Constitution, we just have to live by this Constitution, just obey this Constitution. But that isn't the Constitution anymore. It's not in a pocket. The Constitution is actually printed by the General Printing Office, and it's over 3,000 pages annotated. The Supreme Court and amendments to the Constitution have fundamentally changed the Constitution, and all of those amendments have centralized more power in Washington. The founders created a republic, and they believed in federalism. They believed that a powerful central government was the greatest threat to liberty. And they believed that an individual tyrant, a president, should be limited in power. If you look at the Constitution, all the power is given to the Congress and to the states. The president has very little power. That's not true anymore. As Senator McGilvery, I was an opponent of this proposal for a long time. And what actually flipped me and got me to be a proponent was actually the previous administration. I'd been in Congress a long time, and I sort of knew that Democrats liked to centralize power, and that was a good fight, and we disagreed, and one was more centralized power, and one was more decentralized, and that was a good battle. But then I saw President Trump come in, and I supported a lot of what he wanted to do. I just didn't support how he did it. We shouldn't be running by executive orders. We shouldn't be running by rulemaking that's outside of the scope of rulemaking. The president shouldn't be able to forgive $500 billion in debt with a wave of a pen. But more and more and more, that's happening. I don't understand how that doesn't scare you. That doesn't scare that individual members. I'm not worried about a Congress. I'm not worried about a Congress or a legislature. It's hard to get things done in a Congress or a legislature. It makes wheeling and dealing, it's tough. I mean, heck, they can't even vote to pass a speaker in Congress. They can't do much in Congress, but presidents can. And both parties, I look at Democrats and Republicans here. I know a lot of Democrats who are afraid of what President Trump would do. And I can tell you a lot of Republicans are afraid of what President Biden is doing or what the next president will do. It's getting worse and worse and worse, and it's not going to get better. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolute. We all know this. The history of our republic is replete with it. And so the idea that somehow or another people are going to say, oh, well, this is dangerous. I'll tell you what's dangerous is not taking the power that the founders gave you. If you look back at the founders and the founding documents, it was all about checks and balances. Tom mentioned that. It's all about checks and balances. And who was the ultimate check? Who did they give the real power to in the system? They gave it to you, the state legislatures. We say, how's that? Well, first off, you got to appoint one of the branches of the government, the United States Senate. That power is now gone. That was supposed to be the big check on the federal government. And all you have to do is look at the federal budget before the 17th Amendment and afterwards. Washington, D.C., before the 17th Amendment, before you gave up your power to appoint United States senators, was a backwater town, and the only tax it had was on excise tax on liquor and tariffs. That was it. It did virtually nothing. It was an inconsequential city in America. Then the Senate came in and people had to get elected by doing things for folks back home. I know you don't know what that's like, but that changed everything. All of a sudden, poof, Washington exploded. Exploded. And there is no check anymore except one. I mean, and then when I say the explosion, you also look at the Supreme Court and all the decisions, I say the annotated Constitution. All these decisions that gave more and more and more power wiped out the power of the states and wiped out federalism. People say, well, you know, we can't get along in America. You can't even go to Thanksgiving dinner with your family anymore. Why? Because we're divided. That's not new, ladies and gentlemen. We fought a war 70 years after the founding of the country. It's not new that we're divided. Of course, you're a huge country. Montana is very different than New York. You have been given, final point, you have been given the power in the Constitution under Article 5 to control the federal government. That's your power. You're at the bottom of the food chain right now, but that's not where you belong. That's not where the Congress put you. They put you at the top of the food chain. Article 5 is your power. And if you don't use it, and this country fails, it's on you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next proponent, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. For the record, my name is Wendy Jorgensen, third generation Montana resident. Thank you for hearing my testimony on SJJ2 today. When our founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they ensured that the three co-equal branches would operate on a system of checks and balances with the intent that no one branch could overstep the other. Its constitutional role. These types of checks and balances were continually used throughout the Constitution in order to address the concerns of those opposed to a strong central government. One great example is built into the constitutional amendment process as defined in Article 5. Article 5 was initially drafted with just the one pathway for proposing amendments to the Constitution, the means by which all of our 27 amendments have been proposed. It reads, "The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution." However, in September of 1787, 2 days prior to the adjourning of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, George Mason, whom Thomas Jefferson quoted as saying is the wisest man of his generation, rose to plead for one more proposal. He expressed his fear that the federal government would eventually abuse the balance of powers and would need to be reined in by the states. That would be us. He argued that a runaway government would not be willing to discipline or correct itself or agree to measures that would restrict its powers. We all see that. This proposal, accepted by all the delegates, created a second method to proposing amendments to the Constitution through the states via Convention of States. It reads as, or on the application of the legislators of 2/3 of the several states, shall call convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution. When passed, SJ2 will add Montana to the list of states currently at 19 of the 34 needed to call for a convention of states for proposing amendments limited to imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the term of offices for its officials. The states have already relinquished a great deal of their power to the federal government. Let's not make that mistake with Article 5. Montana legislators need to pass SJ2. Thank you for your time.
Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Kelsey Rothing. I'm from Three Forks, Montana. I'm here today with my husband and 2 little children because this bill is important to us. To me, it's a key thing in helping preserve this country for their future. And so I'd like to briefly share the long history of the Convention of States, but we'll keep it short for you today. The century before Article 5 was drafted in the Constitution, there were at least 32 multi-colony and multi-state conventions. After independence, there were another 11 between 1776 and 1786. By 1787, basic protocols for these types of meetings were well recognized. This included the call to conventions, selecting and instructing delegates, adopting convention rules, conducting convention proceedings, and most importantly, that each colony or state was only given one vote. One state, one vote. Convention of States were also called after the 1787 Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, and that would include in 1861, the country had both a northern and a southern convention triggered by the secession of the southern states. The northern states met in D.C. to propose an amendment to prevent secession and a last-ditch effort to prevent the war, and that was the largest one ever held with 21 participants. Lastly, I'll just mention a few more conventions that came after the Civil War period. In 1889, a regional convention recommended uniform antitrust laws, which induced Congress to pass the Sherman Antitrust Act a year later. In 1920, a series of regional convention of states resulted in the Colorado River Compact in 1922. And from 1946 to 1949, regional convention of states met to divide up the waters of the North Platte River and Rio Grande rivers. So in closing, the history of convention of states in America is as old as our colonial roots. There's no historical record of any convention devolving into a runaway convention or them talking about anything off topic of the call. In Article 5 of Convention of States for proposing amendments as put forth by SJ2 and previously passed by 19 other states will follow this great American tradition. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Would you hold on 1 second, please? Could you spell your last name?
Oh, yes, sir. RothinG.
Rothing. Thank you. And as you people come up to testify, we can take our next proponent. Come on up. As you testify, please, if you have a name that's a little tougher to spell, it's not something simple like Don Jones, please also spell your name.
Got it. Okay. Chairman, thank you very much for allowing me to testify. The distinguished members, my name is Terry Kramer. It's T-E-R-R-Y-K-R-A-M-E-R. I'm a resident of Clancy, Montana. Starting out, 1787 was a milestone year for the United States. On May 13th, 55 commissioners from 12 states met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. However, this convention was not the only significant event of that year. Just 3 months prior, on February 21st, the Congress of the Confederation released the following opinion, and I'm going to summarize for you. They stated that Congress recommends to the 13 states at the Philadelphia Convention be limited to the purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation, and that it report back to Congress. So, if you only consider Congress's opinion that February, it might appear to the uninformed that the Philadelphia Convention did exceed its call or run away. But there's more to this story. The previous year, in September of '86, a convention of states was held in Annapolis. The Annapolis Convention was formally titled, quote, Meeting of Commissioners to Remedy Defects of the Federal Government, end quote. The Annapolis Convention was a general convention. All 13 states were formally invited. However, only 5 attended. Without the ability to reach a quorum, the Annapolis Convention had to adjourn, but they issued a call to meet the following May of '87 in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, what turned out to be the Constitutional Convention. The Annapolis call was for a broad convention in Philadelphia. It happened 5 months before Congress's opinion was issued in February of '87 and 8 months before the Philadelphia Convention actually convened. On the heels of the Annapolis Convention in November of '86, the Virginia legislature formally approved the convention in even broader language than was issued at the Annapolis Convention. And realizing that only 5 states who had attended the Annapolis Convention, they reissued the call directly to all 13 states, and New Jersey did a similar call at about the same time period. So at the end of 1787, we had a total of 7 states who had RSVP'd for the Philadelphia Convention, and the 5 most recent states had written their commission orders to allow the same scope and power that Virginia had declared in their call, and New Jersey had concurred. So New Jersey had even gone so far as to appoint as commissioners to the Philadelphia Convention. None of these 7 states at this point in time had limited their delegates to just amending the Articles of Confederation. This was completed 2 months, again, before Congress's opinion in February of 1787 and 6 months before Philadelphia convened. So finally, at the end of February, 3 more states had RSVP'd to the Virginia call. That brought the total number to 10, and they all had commission statements in line with what Virginia had issued in the call. 2 states, New York and Massachusetts, did RSVP, but limited to only amending the Articles of Confederation. Rhode Island did not attend. So in conclusion, the historical record shows that based on the calendar events, this process was long in process before Congress's February opinion. The train had basically left the station. So the Philadelphia Convention was not a runaway. The call for the convention was broad enough to either amend or replace the Articles of Confederation. 10 states concurred, 2 didn't, But even those 2 states later on changed their commissions to match the previous 10. So with that, I thank you very much for the chance to
Thank you.
share that with you.
Okay, next proponent, please.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, my name is Dan McLean, spelled M-A-C-L-E-A-N. I live in Billings. I've been engaged in collecting petitions in support of the Convention of States effort to encourage state legislators to pass the resolution requesting a meeting for the purpose of proposing amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Here in Montana, we've collected in excess of 16,000 signatures from your constituents in support of passing this resolution so that we may join 19 other states that have passed the same resolution. 3,579 petitions have been collected in the past year alone with a broad base of support across the state. Our petitioning efforts have included numerous public events with a broad spectrum of interest. We have found that about 2/3 of the people we engage are supportive and sign the petition. Keep in mind that we've collected petitions on Election Day and have received support from people of all political stripes, which is consistent with national polling. Your voters are fed up of the federal government, and they want change. When we explain the 3 tenets of the Convention of States resolution and get to term limits, I have personally had numerous people grab the clipboard out of my hand and say, "This is a big issue for me, I'll sign on that." Term limits are a huge issue with your constituents, and they've been quite vocal, voicing their disdain towards politicians with decades-long tenure. There are U.S. senators like Schumer, Grassley, and Markey that have been in office in Washington longer than some of the members of this committee have been alive. People are sick and tired of what is happening in our country, and they feel no elected representatives are addressing their concerns. I have found our combat veterans to be some of the most passionate about what is happening. Many of them have lost friends in battle, were wounded after they made commitments to serve our country and defend the Constitution. They have been disgusted with the way our government and walked away from me unable to talk about it anymore. Senators, you have the authority and responsibility under the U.S. Constitution in Article 5 to take action. Please pass this resolution and show concerned Montanans that you're listening to your voters. I urge you to be on the right side of pursuing a Convention of States meeting and by passing SJ2 and support the COS resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, I'd like to remind everybody, please turn your cell phones off or your ringers. Testimony to 3 minutes. Thank you. Next proponent.
Good morning. My name is Matthew Cooper, 2 T's, 2 O's. I live here in Helena, and Convention of States is dear to my heart, and I support SJ2. First of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to submit for the record truthful information on the pathways for proposing amendments. This testimony is to counter the substantial misinformation fed to this body over the years on the topic of Article 5. There are 2 amendment pathways. It's already been read by other people. I won't read them again from the text from Article 5. Pathway 1, though, the congressional pathway, is the least restrictive. It is not limited to any topics or any time restraints, and any proposed amendment only requires 2/3 support in both houses of Congress to be sent to the states for approval. In contrast, however, Pathway 2, the Convention of States pathway, is much more rigorous. It requires legislative passage of identical resolutions in 2/3 of the states. That means that 34 states must call for a convention and agree on all the topics. Only when 34 states have passed the same legislation can the call occur. The Convention of States for proposing amendments will be limited to the scope of the call as specified in the legislation passed by each of the 34 states. So far, 19 states have already passed the legislation, and they are strictly limited to imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and imposing term limits on Congress and federal officials. We ask that Montana become number 20. Our opposition, led by the John Birch Society, intentionally conflates the definitions of the conventions by falsely calling it a con-con or a constitutional convention. This is a blatant falsehood, as this convention of states can only propose amendments to the existing Constitution, not rewrite it. Our framers provided us two ways to amend the Constitution because they knew they needed there to be a safeguard against a tyrannical federal Congress. Our opponents make a silly argument. They say that somehow 34 states would pass legislation for a convention whose purpose is to propose amendments to limit federal power, but then 38 states would pivot to a rewrite of the Constitution. Mr. Chairman, I can assure you that states like Florida, Texas, and others that have passed this call to limit federal power did not sign up to rewrite the Constitution. They're using this tool as intended by our framers. Thankfully, the second half of Article 5 requires 3/4 of the states to ratify any proposed amendments. That's 38 states. Our opponents are crazy if they think 38 states want to rewrite the Constitution. We, however, aren't, because we think 38 states will want to put the federal government back in its place by ratifying amendments to limit their power. With 38 states to ratify means it only takes 13 states to veto any bad amendments. That math alone prevents any runaway scenarios. In conclusion, if anyone believes in the false narrative that SJ2's youth of Pathway 2 will cause a runaway convention, they are wrong, and they are misleading this honorable body on the legislation that is before it. Please use your power to save our country. Thank you very much for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Senators. I'm Joe Hushek. That's spelled H-O-S-E-C-K, and I'm from Great Falls. Many who oppose the Convention of States resolution before you are offering nullification as an alternative. Nullification is a legal theory that U.S. states can refuse to comply with federal laws they deem to be unconstitutional. Nullification is an opportunity that only presents itself when specific laws are passed or specific federal executive actions are enacted that have an impact on we, the citizens of Montana, or any other state governments. Federally funded unconstitutional laws and executive decrees are intentionally difficult for states to nullify because typically come attached with federal funding. The Affordable Care Act is a prime example. The accompanying federal funds, heavily loaded in the early years, made it appealing and very difficult for states to choose nullification. When has the federal government ever presented to this state legislature the $31 trillion national debt? The answer is never, and there is no requirement to do so. So how can nullification address this? The truth is it can't. The same is true of term limits on Congress, a position that regularly polls over 80% positive nationwide. The Supreme Court has already ruled that federal term limits can only be achieved by amending the Constitution. Common sense and history have shown us that Congress will never limit its power in areas like a balanced budget or term limits. Up until 1913, the state legislatures had a powerful constitutional tool for controlling the federal government. With the ratification of the 17th Amendment, state legislatures no longer directly appointed U.S. senators and forfeited considerable leverage over the federal government. That leaves the state legislatures with only Article 5 and the Convention of States to proposing amendments to address these foundational problems. The legislation before you today is a call for the convention strictly limited to impose federal fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and impose term limits on Congress and federal officials. The Montana State Legislature only has one tool left, That is, joining the previous 19 other states and pass SJ2. The Convention of States for Proposing Amendments is the last safe, nonviolent, and constitutional solution for the problem of our republic. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Next proponent, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jane Hammond, J-A-N-E-H-A-M-M-A-N, a citizen of Clancy. I ask that Montana become the 20th state to ratify this. For years, I have resisted the arguments of the John Birch Society, who have primarily conflated the definitions of such a convention by calling it falsely a con or a constitutional convention. I have numbers of friends who, as so eloquently our first two proponents, resisted this Convention of States. They believed these falsehoods and were afraid, as many citizens are afraid. They are false. Our framers provided us with this way to overcome the tyranny of a federal Congress, and it is time that we too join the others. One of my friends, who so adamantly for a decade resisted this effort, was Shirley Heron. And 2 years ago, she heard a lecture about the truth of this effort, which you have heard this morning, and she came to me and said, "Jane, at the next session, I will join you in testifying on behalf of this effort." In Shirley's honor and all the others who are recognizing that our country is going down a path towards destruction, I plead with you to vote yes.
Thank you. Next proponent.
Committee members, Mr. Chairman, thanks for letting me testify today on this most important item. My name is Robert Kohler, or Bob Kohler, K-O-L-A-R. I'm a resident of Helena and a taxpayer here. I live on the west side of town. I'm here to set some things straight, some housekeeping stuff that I hear from senators all the time, including mine the other day. I am on the executive board of the Big Sky Tea Party and have been since close to the inception of this. I'm also a member of the Tea Party Patriots, where Mark Meckler and Jenny Beth Martin started that group, and Mark Meckler is heading up the Convention of States nowadays. So I've been involved in this since near the beginning of this. So I wanted to let you know about when I say Tea Party, so many people, senators like mine, assume I'm against the Convention of States. I'm not. I'm a strong for, and when we go through our Tea Party groups, which I'm part of the, like I say, the group here in Helena, also the Tea Party Coalition that put all the conventions together in Montana here for all the Tea Parties throughout the state, we find that most of us are for the Convention of States. But there's a radical group called the John Birch Society that infiltrated our group, and I'm not going to read this whole thing because I only have 3 minutes, but I'm going to pass you a copy of this so you can see how they did that. I think it's important for you to understand how Robert Brown and Eve Brown first got into where they have more of a voice than the radical John Birchers had before that. So I'll give you a copy of this after I sit down. You know, last year we were here and we said, oh, let the system work itself out. There's things in play. It's not working, guys. It's not working. Look what's going on. We got the FBI censoring speech. We are this check. We need to do something. You called to do that. So this comes today where we're at with the Convention of the States in Montana. Most of the 50 states, 27 has passed this or some process. You've heard other people say about 19. On the back of this, you'll see a map of 27 states that have passed this in some form or another. 19 have passed it fully. The momentum is clearly on our side. For the record, 19 states have passed in full, 6 states partially, with Montana and Connecticut considering it this year. Don't let Montana be left in the dust and looking in from the outside and saying, why weren't we there with our friends from the other states? The radical birchers like to preach doom and gloom, the chicken little thing, the sky is falling. They have no basis in any of this stuff. They spend a lot of untruths, such as they say it'll be a runaway constitutional convention, which is simply not true. It's going to be limited in scope and...
Please wrap up.
Please wrap up. Okay.
Yes,
So in wrapping up, we put a number of constitutional scholars come to town, and we had record crowds come out at all of them. Rob Nadelson was one of them. I'll close now. Please vote yes for this. So can I approach to give her copies of this for all of you?
Yes. Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Stu, S-T-U, last name Goodner, G-O-O-D-N-E-R, out of Boulder. My name is Stu Goodner. My wife and I live in Boulder, where we run the Panther Pit, a place where the youth of Jefferson County can hang out and get a free lunch. It is also where we serve as deacon at our church and teach biblical citizenship and Constitution classes. It's because of the latter that I'm always excited to talk about what an amazing governing document our Constitution is. Simple enough to fit in the breast pocket of your jacket, yet robust enough to govern one of the greatest countries the earth has ever seen for over 230 years now. In the same time frame, Canada has had 2 constitutions, Russia 4, Germany 5, Mexico 6, Poland 8, Spain 12, Chile somewhere between 4 and 8, and France over 15 constitutions. One of the keys to the Constitution's longevity is our founders' wisdom in building in 2 processes for amending it. Part of this wisdom is making the amendment process very difficult. More than 11,000 amendments have been proposed, yet only 27 have been ratified into law. There are some that propagate a false narrative about a runaway convention or somehow losing the Constitution through this process. This can quickly and easily be debunked as either ignorance of the process or worse, a level of disingenuousness. State legislatures, such as this one, establish the parameters for the convention. Delegates that do not adhere to the wishes of the legislature can and should be recalled and replaced at any time. Finally, the work product of the convention is non-binding until ratified by 3/4 of the states. Based on this, we can see that state legislatures, such as yourselves, have control of the process from the beginning through the convention to the final step of ratifying any proposed amendments. Therefore, it is impossible for them, for you, to somehow lose control. Our constitutional amendment process is difficult, requires a great investment of time, but well worth the effort. Through this process, we've established an end to slavery, guaranteed freedoms of religion, speech, and the press, the right to bear arms, and the right for all people to vote, regardless of race and gender. One of the most important amendments, in my opinion, is that the powers not specifically given to the federal government are given to the states, and therefore the people. In summary, our Constitution is stable and strong. Our country is as well, as long as it adheres to this governing document. We need to continue to strengthen the Constitution by using it as designed, such as the constitutional amendment process found in Article 5. Therefore, please support SJ2. Thank you.
Thank you. Next proponent.
My name is Keith Duncan from Great Falls, Keithduncan. Mr. Chairman, Senators, fellow Montanans, the case for term limits in Washington has never been more popular. In multiple polls and surveys, Americans in every corner of our country are making their voice heard. They're fed up with politicians that make Congress a career. The re-election rate in Congress is well over 90%. meaning incumbents are almost unbeatable. Unless a seat is open, that race usually lacks serious challengers. This is not what the founders envisioned. What we have today is not a citizen legislature, but rather a professional ruling class that lives and works in Washington, D.C. Term limits would reverse this trend by ensuring that open seat races are held on a regular basis. Term limits would give Congress a fresh infusion of talent, and members would be empowered to be more involved. That would be a major win for we the people. One of the loudest arguments against term limits goes something like this. Lobbyists love term limits because it gives them more influence. Let's consider that for a minute. If you were a lobbyist, what would be your preference? Working with legislatures that you knew well and have a relationship with, or where there is constant turnover? Building relationships takes time, and our lobbyist friends know that. That's why they oppose term limits. Allow me to quote former mega lobbyist and convicted felon, Jack Abramoff. Like almost every lobbyist I knew, I didn't want to have to build relationships with new members constantly. A representative who stayed in office for decades and was a friend was worth his weight in gold. I'm continuing to quote, but permitting people to rule for decades is a recipe for disaster. Is there really any difference between a permanent Congress and a president for life? End quote. Please support SJ2. Please return our government to we the people. Thank you.
Thank you. Next proponent.
Hi, my name is Christine Agin, A-G-I-N, and I'm from Stevensville in the Bitterroot Valley. I'm here to testify today because my background is in economics and finance, and I'm here to speak to you on the need for a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The federal government has maxed out its ability to tax its citizens. There is an economic law called Hauser's Law that demonstrates that the federal government simply cannot collect more than 19% of GDP in tax rates, or in taxable income, regardless of tax rates or new tax avenues. Please see the chart that I have provided for you guys. Doesn't matter what they do with tax rates, this is all they can collect. And herein lies the problem. For our current out-of-control federal government, because they are currently spending 25% of GDP, a full 8% more than they are able to collect. Spending has exceeded 20% of GDP for over 2 decades now, with no sign of slowing. What this means is the federal government either has to print or borrow money to cover their continued shortages. If they borrow it, then the interest is added to the debt that they then have to have more revenue to repay. If they print it, we see rampant inflation. Our federal government has been juggling these two techniques for their runaway spending. Doing this is what is causing our inflation recession cycles that have accelerated and caused harm to the people of this country. Our national debt is $31 trillion. If you tried to count to $1 trillion, it would take you 31,963 years, and we have 31 times that. Our current inflation rate is somewhere between 7 and 10%, and that's if you don't include food and energy, which of course we need. That means that senior citizens on fixed incomes have 10% less savings than they did last year. And the federal government shows no signs in slowing its spending. See my spending chart. No federal politician wants to take the hard task of cutting spending. Do you know why? Because every spending item has a voting constituency and a donor base. Nobody wants to take that on. So where does that leave us? How do we get the government to stop spending money that it simply cannot collect? I have heard no solutions outside of an Article 5 convention to pass a balanced budget amendment. Okay? This would not only help families now, but this would stop this from happening to future generations. In the 1980s, America's strategy in the Cold War was to get the Soviet Union to
Please wrap up.
I will. To spend money that they simply could not collect. We engaged them in a spending strategy that collapsed one of the greatest superpowers in the world. The opponents to this Article 5 convention will try to scare you that if we do this, this might happen, or that might happen, or this could happen, with no evidence. I'm here to tell you, if we do not pass a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, fiscal collapse will happen, and I have brought the evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Hello, my name is Lindsay Doyle. Lindsay is L-Y-N-D-S-E-Y. And I am also from Stevensville, Montana. And I am here to briefly talk to you also about term limits. Consistent turnover in our federal government ensures new members who are free from the institutional biases that long-term service brings and results in less of the current tradition of exchanging favors. We've already been over re-election rates. I've included 2 graphs for you showing visually how those have turned around. Enacting term limits will also encourage more level competition. Incumbents are at a marked advantage. They have several taxpayer benefits, like receiving their government salary while campaigning and a paid staff to assist them. Travel allowances and franking benefits alone save them hundreds of thousands of dollars. Donors almost exclusively contribute to incumbent campaigns as they are seen as a good investment with a high rate of return. Limiting the influence of special interest is extremely important in our efforts to bring about change in Washington. Federal lobbyists in 2022 spent $3.6 billion. This immense amount of spending isn't indicative of the amount of influence they have over our policy. The view that long-term service is essential to understand the complex legislative process speaks to the sad state of our current congressional system. We are supposed to be a government of the people. However, if the people can't navigate the system, the process is no longer of the people and needs to be changed. I encourage you to do your research and to support this bill on our behalf. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next proponent.
Good morning. My name is Peggy, P-E-G-G-Y, Bates, B-A-T-E-S, and I'm from Thompson Falls. Mr. Chairman, when I'm trying to decide where I stand on a certain issue, I like to look at who supports the issue and who opposes the issue, then do the research of the facts and make my decision. Here are some people who support the Convention of States. Governor Ron DeSantis, Senators Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, Tucker Carlson, Dr. James Dobson, Dr. Ben Carson, David Barton, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, Michael Ferris, Rick Santorum, and Mark Levin. Mark Levin wrote the book, The Liberty Amendments, but when he first had the idea of writing the book, he was going to write against calling a convention of states. He researched and studied to write his book, and then he said, wait a minute, I'm on the wrong side of this issue. The difference seems to be between researching the facts and listening to the scare tactics. However, I think there is a group of people, as already mentioned, that should be your greatest consideration, and that is the over 16,000 people here in Montana who have signed a petition asking you to support calling a convention of states. Now let's look at some people who oppose this issue. Hillary Clinton is recorded as saying, "There's a big move for change coming to this from the right, and I think it would be disastrous for our country. They want to have a constitutional convention to rewrite our Constitution. I hate to correct Hillary, but it is not a constitutional convention. It is a convention of the states for proposing amendments, not rewriting the Constitution. Others who are opposed to this are Senators Barry Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Planned Parenthood, ACLU, Common Cause, Sierra Club, League of Women Voters, Greenpeace, and the John Birch Society. A delegate to the Constitutional Convention, William Davey, said, "It is easier to alarm people than to instruct them." I hope that you will consider the facts and study this and not just listen to scare tactics. Please support SJ2. Thank you.
Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chairman and Committee, James Barkley, B-A-R-K-L-E-Y, Guilford, Montana. I'm a supporter of SJ2, and I'd like to urge you to vote yes on it. I believe the time is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next proponent.
Good morning, Chairman and Committee. I'm Georgia Miller, Georgiamiller, and I am from Great Falls. I'm a third-generation Montana. I have 12 grandchildren. I 100% support SJ2. I believe that America is the greatest nation in the history of the world, and our federal government is out of control. I thank God every single day that I get to live in Montana and I get to live in the United States of America. But when I look at the future, it seems like our country is going in the wrong direction, and I fear for what could happen for my grandchildren. I have had an amazing, amazing life here in Montana, and I would love for my grandchildren to be able to have the same life that I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Next proponent.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Cliff Sisko, S-I-S-K-O. I'm from Miles City, Senate District 20. I would like to speak to the power of fear. Opponents of SJ2 have a simple strategy for stopping the passage of SJ2, and that is fear. Fear of any COSPA morphing and replacing our U.S. Constitution. Fear that the U.S. Constitution will commandeer, Congress will commandeer the COSPA with unpredictable results. Fear that the COSPA will wander off topic with unpredictable results. Fear that Montana will not have equal influence and an equal vote. Fear of change. This false fear narrative pushed by the SJ2 opponents has no historical precedence. Fear is an easy sell to people with limited knowledge, and it strikes an emotional response. Fear paralyzes. Well, on the other hand, proponents of using Article 5 COSPA have a much more difficult strategy for passage of SJ2. Proponents have to educate, and education perpetuates knowledge and understanding, which calms fears. What is possible consequence of giving in to fear and not doing anything? I hear every day from people I talk to that they fear if what is happening in Washington is not changed or stopped, we will find ourselves in a civil war. David Horowitz says in his new book, Final Battle, and I quote, "America is on the precipice of another civil war, end quote. One of our most ardent opposition is the John Birch Society. The JBS has a constitutional mission statement, and it states, our mission is to bring about less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world by providing leadership, education, and an organized volunteer action in accordance with moral and constitutional principles. The JBS website also states for 60 years the John Birch Society has been the force that protects and restores American liberty and independence. If the JBS has been at this for over 60 years and they have a mission statement to bring about less government, then how come Washington, D.C. has been growing exponentially during this time period? How come national debt is over $31 trillion? How come we are on the verge of 83,000 new IRS agents budgeted for? As much as I support the JBS mission, I have to ask myself that after 60 plus years of this, how has it worked out? The answer
Please
is
wrap
not
up,
good.
sir.
The efforts of the John Birch Society have not produced the desired goal of their mission statement in over 60 years. Given that fact, I say it's time to use another method given us under the Article 5 by the founders. Thank you.
Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Honorable members, thank you for allowing me to speak today. Those who oppose an Article 5 my name is Sandy Dunning. I'm from Shepherd. It's D-U-N-N-I-N-G. Those who oppose an Article 5 Convention of States oppose it out of fear, a fear of a runaway convention or fear of getting rid of the Constitution altogether. You know what I'm afraid of? I am afraid of a DOJ that will become completely politicized and act at the behest of one party. I'm afraid of that same DOJ that would spy on and encourage prosecution of parents who disagree with what their children are being taught in school. I'm afraid to see a president and his aides only allow government-approved, fact-checked propaganda to be released to the public. I'm afraid of a Federal Reserve that prints $6 trillion out of thin air. I'm afraid of vengeful DC bureaucrats accumulating power to force citizens to take an experimental drug in order to serve in the military or to hold certain jobs. Mr. Chairman, as you know, these are not imaginary fears. While we sit here and listen to the opponents fearmonger about things that might happen, our great Constitution is being trashed. To the opponents of this resolution, I ask, what are you not afraid of about the reality that surrounds us today? We are listening to ridiculous excuses and ghost stories as to why we can't use the founders' tools, why we deal with the preposterous arguments about a runaway convention. The circle of liberty is growing smaller and our treasury is being looted. We are less free and less prosperous because a nanny state will not allow us to make our own decisions and live our own lives. We can't develop energy and build pipelines. We can't fully develop natural resources and provide jobs to our citizens because a small group of elites in the deep state tell us we can't. The feds think that they have the authority to shut down our economy for whatever crisis they declare. And tell me again, what is so scary about a convention of states to propose amendments? Start being scared about what's real and what's right in front of your eyes. Only you, acting in your constitutional role, can save this country. A convention of states to propose amendments is not a dangerous or crackpot idea. It is in the mainstream of constitutional governance. It is a tool right there in your toolbox. It's time to do your duty, advance this resolution. If not now, then when? When do we finally acknowledge enough is enough and agree to utilize the measure granted to us by the Founding Fathers in Article 5 of the Constitution? Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next proponent.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee. My name is Kristen Wing, W-I-N-G, not Wig. I'm from Thompson Falls, Montana, and I'm going to make this brief because I don't want to repeat. Terms such as limited power, the separation of powers, the rule of the people, checks and balances, and the need for amendments all existed for one simple reason: people abuse power. In fact, Washington asserted the human depravity could ultimately destroy the Constitution, even with the checks and balances it possessed. Let me close with James Garfield. More than ever before, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. If that body be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, it is because the people tolerate it. If the next centennial does not find us a great nation, it will be because the people who represent the enterprise, the culture, and the morality of the nation did not control the political forces. It is time that the people who represent us take back control and make the sovereign state of Montana the 20th state to be part of the Convention of States. Thank you.
Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Sharon Nason. Last name is N as in Nancy, A-S-O-N. I think you would pretty much have to be a Rip Van Winkle to not be aware of the heightened level of dysfunction in Washington, D.C. over the past few years. The partisan bickering, backstabbing, lying, and overall irresponsibility of Congress, to say nothing of the slew of executive orders, has literally been disgusting to watch. When was the last time that Congress passed a budget? I couldn't remember, so I looked it up, and it was 1996, almost 30 years ago. They just keep passing the continuing resolutions. Does anyone actually think Congress will pass term limits on themselves? I don't. I don't believe they're going to give up the perks that come with their positions. How is it that members of Congress who make a little less than $200,000 a year suddenly become multimillionaires after a few years in Congress? Yesterday, I happened to be in the Senate gallery when you voted on your salary for 2025, and you increased your salary to a whopping $13 and some cents an hour. My granddaughters work at Taco Bell, and they make $16 an hour. Each of you is what Congress was intended to be, servant leaders. None of you are going to become multimillionaires by serving in the Montana legislature, nor will this become a lifelong career for you. And thanks to responsible decisions by elected officials, Montana has a surplus, unlike the federal government that has a $30 trillion debt. So I believe it is long past time to force Congress to operate more like the Montana legislature than the way they've been operating of late, by forcing them to pass a balanced budget, limit their power to intrude on Montana, and return them to servant leaders by imposing term limits. That's why I support SJ2 in the Articles of Convention. Thank you.
Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is David Wyrick, W-Y-R-I-C-K. This is my wife, Diane. We are from Forsyth, Montana, and we would just like to ask that you support and vote for SJ2 so that Montana can become a member of the Convention of States. Thank you.
Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, my name is Ashton Loomis, A-S-H-T-O-N-L-O-O-M-I-S, and I'm a resident of Helena. I'm a proponent of SJ2 because something is broken in D.C. This is a mechanism the framers gave us to rein in the federal government. It is our last defense to save our nation from corruption and out-of-control spending. Please vote in support of SJ2. Thank you.
Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chairman and committee, my name is Donna Barkley, and I'm a proponent of SJ2. I live in Guilford, Montana. I'm a mom, a grandma, I'm a veteran, and a school teacher. I've looked at this, and it's an important thing for Montana. Please consider it.
Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity today.
My name is Jody Loomis, Loomis. I live in the Helena Valley. I'd just like to say that I don't see any calls or any bills suggesting that the state of Montana rescind its Balanced Budget Act or law. I don't see that we should, people are calling that we end term limits. So it's pretty clear that the state of Montana supports, and the people of Montana support term limits and a balanced budget. So what's the holdup? I think it's the fear of the process. I've been a student of the Convention of States for many years. I've followed, I've listened to the arguments for quite a while and thought about them. I remember that the Convention of States had a simulated convention that they held where they brought individuals in from state legislatures. They all got together and had discussions over what's our problem, what do these states share with one another, and they discussed how could we limit the federal government to help the states out. I would like Montana to be part of that discussion. It's taken off. Last time when this first came before the state legislature, the article for the state to call for this convention, I testified in this very room. I think there's 4 people that were proponents, and the other half of the room was opponents. Oh man, this isn't going well. Look at today. I mean, this is a wonderful day. Things are really changing. So I'm not afraid of the process. I have much more trust in our state legislature than I do in what's going on in Washington, D.C. What scares me is $31 trillion in debt. We're looking at a point where we can't even finance the debt, and it's time to pay attention. So I ask you please support this, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next proponent, please. Do we have any more proponents in the room?
Good morning, Senator Chair and committee.
You can adjust that mic a little bit.
Good morning. Thank you for listening to our love of country, basically. My name is Lynette Band, Lynette, Band, B-A-N-D. I live in Lolo, and I would just like to remind you that the states created the federal government. The federal government did not create the states. Please vote yes on SJ2.
Thank you. Do we have more proponents in the room? More proponents? Okay, seeing none, we will go online. I know we have some proponents online.
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have 2 proponents online today, first of which will be Alicia Hamilton.
Okay, please, Alicia.
Hi, my name is Alicia Hamilton, A-L-I-C-I-A, last name Hamilton, H-A-M-I-L-T-O-N. And can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I was here 2 years ago in support of SJ2 as an onlooker who spontaneously felt the need to testify in support of Montana state application for amendment convention that would hold our federal government accountable. I had never been to a congressional committee hearing, and I'm not really politically inclined, though I am fiercely patriotic and served as a physician assistant at that time for 28 years in the Army National Guard. I was dumbfounded at that time about the amount of street slang that was given in testimony. I thought that term limits and fiscal restraints were common sense terms, but had not heard of a con-con. I'm thankful for that day because it really opened my eyes. I delved into the education that seems to be conveniently removed from our public school system, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. I signed as a constitutional coach at Wall Builders, watched hours of class time from the John Birch Society, the Constitutional Study podcast, Freedom Papers podcast, hosted by Turning Point USA and more. And I'm by no means a subject matter expert. However, I am now an engaged citizen. So last time I was here, I was a business owner of a small independent clinic, and it had closed due to federal monopolization of the healthcare system. Payment for services contingent on ICD codes are a system that began only to stratify disease epidemiology across the nations and now deemed as a pay scale for services. Our system is double blinded where the patient has no idea what the service is worth and the provider doesn't know if they're going to get paid. And this is not a free market system. If there was one thing that COVID taught me is that our freedoms are always under attack. Our three-legged system has been made to have checks and balances, and something that democracy does not do the same way. This year, our government has pushed the investigational genetic treatments on our military, something that wasn't supposed to happen after the Tuskegee experiments or the anthrax vaccinations. They pushed the investigational genetic treatments on the public under the unelected three-letter organizations, despite Nuremberg trials. EUA testing and treatments were all that were allowed. Unconventional treatments and free speech was suppressed. One world order is no longer a conspiracy theory. The delegative authority of Article 5 is only for an amendment. I encourage you to use this tool to legally pressure federal Congress to hold their oath to the Constitution. We do need term limits. We do need fiscal restraints. I would just encourage you to not live in fear of what may happen because we have to be moral to expect a moral outcome. And the only way that we can continue as a joint effort with our state brothers is to push Congress via an amendment ratified by 38 states, which is the fail-safe for why this cannot go awry. Put our hat in for Montana, and please use your delegative authority to be one of the 38. I would love for Montana to be number 20. Thank you for this time to testify.
All righty, thank you. Next up.
Next up, we'll have Vince Zortman.
Go ahead, Vince, you are muted.
Good morning. Vincent Zortman, Z-O-R-T-M-A-N, just like the town. Can't add anything to all the wonderful statements that have been made. I just encourage you to support SJ2. And I will tell you the Flathead Valley is on board with this idea. We drew 300 people on a rainy May night to listen to Senator Santorum talk about this. It was a wonderful crowd. We've been to county fairs. We've been to gun shows. The Flathead Valley's on board. Please support SJ2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any proponents left online?
No remaining proponents, Mr. Chair.
All righty, thank you. Next, we will move to opponents of the bill. Please remember, 3 minutes or less. First up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gordy Vance, Belgrade, Montana, speaking for myself. Last session, I was a member of the Senate, and I voted against this resolution, and I'm here to speak against it again. I just have a couple of things, and Mr. Chairman, I'm pretty sure I won't take 3 minutes, but let me know if I do. First of all, I'm concerned, as a lot of folks are, about the assurances we've gotten that opening up the United States Constitution would not lead to detrimental effects on other issues. And I won't go into those because that would take me all morning. But what I would like to say, and I've been speaking to folks for the last 2 years when I was in the Senate about this, my first question for everyone has been, does anyone feel that over the last, say, 100 plus years, that our Constitution as currently written has been followed? And pretty much everyone agrees it has not. And I agree with that as well. But then my question is, and this is where people have had a little bit of trouble, what makes folks think that these same people who have been ignoring our Constitution for 100 years are all of a sudden, with 1 or 10 or however many amendments come out of that Constitutional Convention, are going to say, you know what, we've been wrong all this time.
we can see the light. We've had an epiphany. We're now are going to go ahead and follow the Constitution. I have a little bit of trouble seeing that happening. So because of that, while I agree with the proponents in terms of the problems that we have with our Constitution, I just don't see this as being a practical solution. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Next opponent.
Chairman Small, members of the committee, my name is Ed Regan, R-E-G-A-N. I am the chairman of the Broadwater County Republican Central Committee. Today I testify on behalf of our entire Central Committee. We oppose SJ2. America held its first and only convention in 1787. A new Constitution was born. Since that time, all 27 amendments to the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, have passed without calling a second convention. Montana legislatures since the mid-'80s have consistently rejected Article 5 conventions. In 2007, the legislature went one step further and passed SJ 38, which rescinded and canceled all previous applications that Montana had dating back to 1905. Relying on this legislative history, our Central Committee believes that the current resolution might weaken the Constitution by subjecting it to a possible runaway. Historically, the proponents have argued that their convention would be limited to a single issue, such as a balanced budget amendment. However, the current application allows for multiple amendments. SJ2 is so broad and vague, it's already a runaway. Multiple amendments are a departure from past promises that proponents have made to previous legislatures. James Madison justified the right of delegates to ignore their instructions from the Continental Congress in Federalist 40. Madison's sovereign delegate doctrine, established at the Philadelphia Convention, allowed delegates to scrap the Articles of Confederation and write a new constitution. This established precedent will not be undone. We view any claims that there is a difference between a constitutional convention and an Article 5 amendments convention as nothing more than political spin or linguistic nuance. Article 5 makes no distinction. Convention proponents likewise claim their proposal is safe because the states will control the process. The facts differ. Under Article 5, the only power states have is to apply to Congress for a convention. Once 34 states apply, Congress takes over and calls the convention, not the states. Congress would be acting under its legitimate powers with total control of the process until the gavel drops. However, once it starts, the delegates, acting as sovereign representatives of the people, no longer answer to the state legislatures or to Congress. These impaneled delegates are at liberty to write their own rules and suspend their own rules and do their own thing. Besides endangering some of our most cherished freedoms, we worry a convention might decide to enshrine the unconstitutional behavior and government programs over the last 100 years. Imagine those federal alphabet soup agencies and their administrative regulations suddenly getting upgraded and normalized. In a 2015 speech,
please wrap up.
Justice Scalia warned that a second constitutional convention, quote, is a horrible idea, and this is not a good century to write a constitution. Our Constitution is not the problem. Blatant disobedience to it is the real problem. The Broadwater County Central Committee urges this committee to vote no on SJ2. God bless you and God bless America. And I have submitted written comments online that are lengthier than this and might explain some of these issues. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Next opponent.
Good morning, committee. Dan Scadam, S-K-A-T-T-U-M. Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee, for allowing us to be here. And I also want to thank all the people that are here today every one of us have one thing in common. We know that there's a big problem. I'm going to be a friendly do not pass in spite of my deep respect for Senator McGillivray. I think there's other options. I'll start with, and I'm not going to go back over everything that was said, and 3 minutes is woefully inadequate to talk about it. One point of view is, last session this went on, and there was an offer for a debate, and I would like to see a debate where both sides could be heard on this. Like I said, 3 minutes is woefully inadequate, but respecting your rules here, that would be a great thing. And there was actually a reward posted last year. I don't know if it's still in effect. The problem with that we're addressing is because we do not follow the Constitution. In the U.S. Constitution, Section 8, that's the list of the only things the legislatures can do. And there is guesses that 80% of what they do is null and void, which it should be. As far as an enforcement tool, amendment, the 14th, I've got to get my Roman numerals right. The 14th Amendment, Section 3, I'll just read a couple of places here. Previously taken an oath as a member of Congress, and you're involved in an insurrection or rebellion against the same, or giving aid or comfort to the enemy thereof, you are ineligible for office for the rest of your life. That applies more to what our federal problem is than anything. The First Amendment, our right to petition the government for redress of grievances, that is the one thing that I haven't heard here today nor last year. And that is our avenue of redress of grievance, because if it's not addressed, then they're in violation. I'll stop there, but I respectfully urge you do not pass. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next opponent. Get ready to type this one.
Good morning, Chairman Small and members of, I forgot what committee this is, members of the committee. My name is Patrick Iwaki, spelled Y-A-W-A-K-I-E. Blackfeet is here to show opposition to SJ2. SJ2 is a direct attack on the federal framework of our country. It is also the direct attack on the federal relationship of the federal government and every federally recognized tribe in the United States, and every treaty that has been signed with each tribe. The Blackfeet tribe had signed a treaty with the federal government in 1855, establishing our relationship with not only the federal government, but the state of Montana. If we were to authorize this request, the state of Montana would be opening a whole can of worms. We as members of the democratic system should be working together to find solutions. For these reasons, we stand in opposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next opponent.
Good morning. I am Daniel Keeter, K-E-D-E-R, from Great Falls, testifying today in opposition to SJ2. It is easy to argue for or against a particular bill. It is much more difficult to sit in your seats and to govern, to be responsible for making wise and prudent decisions that uphold the interest of your constituents. You must weigh the potential risks of legislation against possible gains. What are the risks of amending the U.S. Constitution through a convention of the states, the other method of amendment contained in Article 5. I'd maintain to you that it's high because it is unknown territory. It has never been done in the history of the United States. And I believe that fact alone speaks of how potentially dangerous this course of action is or can be. The proponents may be correct in their arguments of how relatively risk-free this process is, how all the safeguards will work as they claim. But what if they aren't? What if the arguments, the opponents' arguments, are substantially correct? At the far end of this spectrum, and again, that's the far end of the spectrum because no one knows. You know, for every great legal expert that'll say the states will be in complete control, there's another one that's going to tell you, no, that's not necessarily the case. So the territory is unknown. We just don't know. So at the far end of the spectrum, you risk opening our national charter to fundamental revision. I maintain at the low end, you risk legitimizing, providing constitutional cover, if you will, for those usurpations that I think this whole audience agrees are already in place. I maintain the evidence tends to support the opponent's warnings regarding the risk. Please reference the second, third, and fourth whereas lines 10 through 15 of SJ2. So why would a federal government that created, and I'll reference it for you, a federal government has created a crushing national debt through improper and imprudent spending. And the federal government has invaded the legitimate roles of the states through the manipulative process of federal mandates. The federal government has ceased to live under a proper interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. So why would a federal government that did all of those things, according to SJ2, suddenly reverse itself? Man, let me wrap it up here. Okay, so in conclusion, if your constituents would be satisfied with a lot of those answers, and I'll just hit one more point if I might, and that is the Constitution is not the problem. It is not the cause of the federal government's abuses of power. And I would reference, again, SJ2, and I'd go back to line 14 and 15, which it says itself. It's not, we have these problems because they're not following the Constitution. They're not following a limited government interpretation. So how is amending a document that this government, this Congress is not following going to change anything? So I believe the risks are great, and constitutional amendments will not deliver the anticipated benefits. Make the right decision and kill this bill in committee, please. Thank you so much for your time and your consideration.
Thank you, sir. Next opponent.
Morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Alan Lackey, L-A-C-K-E-Y. I'm a resident of Stevensville. I'm a retired butcher and the state committee man for the Ravalli County Republican Central Committee. I'm here today representing myself, but an additional 240 Montanans who have signed their names in opposition to SJ2. I would like to ask the chairman if I may submit this petition to the committee.
Yes, you can give it to the secretary.
Thank you. The framers of the Constitution created Article 5 in order to provide an orderly method to correct any defects or errors, such as lack of safeguards of people's unalienable rights. By defects, they did not mean lack of adherence to the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is an example of a correction for the defect. Never in 235 years has a convention been used to amend the Constitution. There is no ambiguity in Article 5 about who calls a convention. Congress does. The states apply, and the convention proposes amendments. State legislatures may get to ratify changes unless Congress decides ratification will be done by state convention, bypassing the state legislature. The amending process is in the control of the convention by delegates chosen by criteria established by Congress. There is historical and legal precedence that proves this out. Why suddenly is power and influence of the states being declared over a process that is clearly constitutionally the responsibility of Congress? Why have the constitutional powers of the states not been wielded all along? If the states had exercised their duty and responsibility to contain the federal government within its enumerated powers, the people's rights and livelihoods would not be in jeopardy. Opening the Constitution to amending is risky at best, and there is no quick fix. We, the people, and our proxies in state government have advocated our duties and responsibilities to be guardians of the Constitution. It will take a great deal of education and effort to get back on course. Proponents of the Convention of States themselves are uncertain as to the outcome of this initiative. For example, Senator McGilvery, the sponsor of SJ2, in a presentation in Hamilton last spring, when asked about controlling the action of delegates during convention, replied, "You have to send them and hope they do the right thing." Let's not hope, let's do the right thing, let's leave the Constitution alone. Take responsibility, do the hard work, get back to living by the Constitution. Constitution is not broken. Let's follow it, let's defend it, not amend it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Members of the committee.
Next opponent, please.
Good morning, Chairman and members. Thank you for doing this for us. I'm Jim Buterbaugh, B-U-T-E-R-B-A-U-G-H, from Whitehall. I had this lovely speech written up here, and I'm listening to all this stuff, and I'm thinking, wow, yeah, a lot of points on both sides. And then I got this message that the school that I have the privilege of being paid to maintain is voted the best school in Montana this morning. That was Cardwell School in Cardwell, Montana. One of the things we do at Cardwell is we teach civics. We teach about the Constitution. This is something schools don't do anymore. You can change the Constitution all you want, but if you don't know the Constitution, if you don't know how our country works, what happens? And that's where we are today. This is not taught in school. So now we have all these people running around, and the senators and legislators up in D.C., not Helena, D.C. can do what they want pretty much because nobody understands how it's supposed to work. If you want to make a difference in this state, insist that we bring the education of what our system is back to school so kids know. They grow up ignorant. They grow up ignorant on this. We use Prager University at the Cardwell School, I'm happy to say. If you want to make a difference, that's where to go. It doesn't do any good to amend the Constitution with anything if nobody knows what the heck they're doing. So, thank you.
Thank you. Next opponent, please.
I have to start out by chuckling. The Master at Arms told me to move this up so everybody can hear me, and I have to warn you, I've never been accused of not being heard. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to tell you I'm Bob Wagner from Harrison, Montana. I serve on the Madison County Central Committee of Republicans down there. I applaud your efforts to be here, and I respect the fact that you're here to listen to a very serious situation here in our country. As I sit back in the back and I witness both sides of this, I see that both sides have very much so in common. They want to have a limited budget. They want to have truth and honor and dignity restored back to the process. My only concern is that, folks, I'm a landscape contractor by trade, and I can tell you a little bit about the Tree of Liberty. You can't paint a few leaves on the outer edges and make it any better than what it already is, because what the problem is it's diseased at the roots. We have a rot in our country. We have a filthy rot in our country that's attacked the roots of the trees of liberty, of our tree of liberty. The only way to fix that is to attack the rot at that tree. We have a disobedience to the law, to the Constitution. We have a misunderstanding of the Constitution. We have an ignorance of the Constitution that I witnessed when I served as a House District 71 legislator in these chambers. I asked 100 members on the House in my first session in 2009, how many read the Constitution before they actually took that oath up here. And I'm going to tell you, it's shameful. There was 7 out of 100. 7 out of 100. And their votes basically supported that. Okay? I hope they got better over time. I see many of those faces over and over up here for the last 15, 20 years. In Montana, we have term limits, so you go from the House to the Senate, from the Senate back to the House, and when you're tired of that and when you get worn out, you get to go into the government services here. You get appointed. So term limits aren't what they're talked about. If you want to talk about a balanced budget in the state of Montana, that's, as far as I'm concerned, a big farce too. It's only limited by the amount that they can get away with taxing you people that they have to live within. That's as simple as it gets. My friends, my good friend Tom McGilvery, I respect him dearly, and I'm happy that he brought this before us so we can debate it. My question would be, and to offer to you, is what would be the fruits of this effort? I'll wrap this up because we have very few that are behind me. I hope you'll indulge me for a little bit. What would be the fruits of this endeavor to add amendments to a Constitution that nobody obeys, defends, understands, and even reads? That's a shameful situation. But I think the solutions, and I'll offer you a few solutions, the sooner that we as a people can recognize that we are one people, one nation under God, we're not divided by our special interests, we're not divided by the color of our skin or the religious beliefs that we have. We have to start considering ourselves as Americans and Montanans and start acting like it. A good solution would be to start abolishing words like they've started to in the woke part. Let's be a little bit woke and abolish special interests. How about that? How many would raise their hand and vote for abolishing special interests in this group? How many people would support abolishing the term of a minority? Let's abolish the term of minority. Let's recognize that we're all indigenous of the same earth, and we all have a right to the same blessings of liberty of which this tree supports. I thank you, and I appreciate your time, and I would very especially thank you for allowing me to finish. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. More opponents, please.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Don Lipinski, L-E-P-I-N-S-K-Y, Whitehall. I first got to Montana in 1979 on a Honda motorcycle and a $5 a day budget. Now I'm a retired aircraft mechanic who intends to invest the rest of his life in Montana. I agree with most of the points made today in opposition to a call for a constitutional convention for most of the reasons given. Yes, the U.S. Constitution isn't perfect, yet at the same time, it is a paradigm that most of the Western world emulates. At best, this call for a convention is political theater. At worst, this opportunity for want-to-be arts to undermine our democracy and individual liberties. Who knows how this resolution will evolve? I got to ask myself, is this call for a convention the result of trickle-down politics from out-of-state interest? Like most Montanans, I resist being herded into a corral of propaganda by out-of-state interests. I can think for myself. I can only hope that you, our elected officials, will ignore any out-of-state marching orders you may have received on this issue and do what is right for Montana by voting against SJ2. Now, I do agree with the proponents that the runaway deficit is a big problem that needs to be addressed. It is going to take time. It is going to take spending cuts. It is going to take long-term pain. We need to get started on reducing the deficit now by working together and not with a convention. In conclusion, I would like to read for the record one of the most powerful quotes in recorded history, and that is, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide the common for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States." Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for the time to testify, and I would like to thank God for the Montana Constitution and our federal Constitution. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next opponent.
Chairman Small and members of the committee, for the record, my name is Terry Lackey, Lackey. I am from Stevensville. I'm a captain for Precinct 18 on the Ravalli County Republican Central Committee. I came here today to tell you that Article 5, Article 6, and the 10th Amendment, what they say. But you, having already taken an oath to uphold it, already know what they say. Am I right? If I'm wrong, we have a serious problem. You already know that Article 5 only gives the states the power to apply for a convention and possibly to ratify. You already know that Article 5 gives the power to call a convention to Congress and Congress only. You already know that the convention is in control of the amendments, not the states. You also know that Article 6 reminds you that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and you took an oath or an affirmation to uphold it. And of course, the 10th Amendment, which has not been mentioned much today, is the foundation from which you base your decisions. The few enumerated powers given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8 leaves everything else to the states or to we the people. This is where you kill or nullify any and all unconstitutional bills. Our Constitution is not broken. We are. We the people have become ignorant of the Constitution, and therefore we will fall for anything when it comes to politics. It's hard to stand for something when you have little or no knowledge. Through our ignorance, we have let people get elected who have misinterpreted what the Constitution actually says. Perhaps it's more sinister than that. But I believe the people are becoming educated to the role we play in your jobs. And I am here today as a native of this great state to remind you that your job is to protect my God-given, unalienable freedoms, rights, and liberties, and not play chess with them. So if you know the Constitution and its original intent from our brilliant founders, excuse me, I am confused why we have to come testify to what you already know. You already know in your heart that applying for a convention at this time in history would be a catastrophic mistake. Don't fall to the pressure. Do what's right. Do your job. Protect my God-given rights. Do not approve SJ2. God bless America. And for those of you who are afraid, I am a chapter leader for the John Birch Society.
Thank you. Next opponent, please.
morning, Chairman Small and members of the committee. My name is Charlie Price. I'm going to read you a little story I wrote.
Would you move the microphone a little bit?
Yeah. I am from Stevensville, Montana. I would like you to know a little about me. I have lived here in Montana just a short amount of time, a few years. I worked in this state several times over the years, rebuilding your high voltage power grid. It was then that I daydreamed that someday I might live in this wonderful state. My wife and I owned and ran a cattle ranch in what is called the high desert country of Central Oregon. It is a beautiful place in the state of Oregon, a state whose largest city was once named the most beautiful. That has changed dramatically under liberal Democrat leadership. It is now a disgusting crap hole, seemingly beyond hope of reversal. I watched the state budget go from approximately $8 to $9 billion a year to $50 billion a year in 6 years. Yet our cities there got worse and still are declining. Disgusted with what was going on, I made the move. I came here to Montana, a breath of fresh air in the beginning of COVID. Much to my disappointment, I saw signs of the same things happening here that has destroyed Oregon. Now, in retirement, and not on the road trying to make a living away from my family, I jumped at the chance to get involved here before it's too late. I met two of the finest people I have ever met who give selflessly of themselves in every way to save our freedom through our beloved Constitution. After meeting them and getting to know them, I was in. We are eager to give back to our state that we love, Montana, our home. We have gone through much study on this journey to learn all we can about our beloved Constitution, and now know just how great it is. A timeless document, beautifully written by men who love this country. It needs no changes. It needs to be followed to the letter of the law. Then we will all have the most wonderful state and country, unbreakable. We do not need a convention of states. We need adherence to the Constitution we have. Please do what we put you in office to do. Obey the will of the people you took an oath to serve. I have talked to hundreds of people all over the Bitterroot where I live, and they do not want this convention of states. I ask you not to take a chance on our Constitution being changed, just uphold it. And you will create a place where you and your families and ours will love for many lifetimes to come. And you will be remembered long after we are all gone for the great things you did just by obeying the Constitution. We the people want you to have our backs, then we will have yours. There is no better feeling than that. Remember, our Father God in heaven gave us this country, and He is watching me, and He is watching you. We all need to do Him proud. Remember what Rambo said in a movie. We want our country to love us like we love it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next opponent, please.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for your time today. My name is Jeff Carter, C-A-R-T-E-R, and Jeff with a J. I would just like to encourage you to not support SJ2. The Constitution isn't broken. It needs to be reread and not rewritten. And I think that, you were put in power and took an oath to the Constitution, and it should be followed the way that you took the oath to do so. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next opponent. Do we have any more opponents in the room? Seeing none, let's go on the line.
Alrighty, yes, we have, looks like 5 opponents online, first of which will be Eldon Stahl.
Okay, Eldon.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Eldon Stahl, S-T-A-H-L, formerly from Montana, but now I'm in Evanston, Wyoming, representing myself, and I'm opposed to SJ2 for many reasons. But there are two which I would like to highlight today as supported by statements of top leaders of the Convention of States project. Links to what I mentioned and their quotes, you can see for yourself in the written testimony I've provided you at the appropriate timestamp, save yourself time. In August of 2013, when the COS project was being launched, Michael Ferris, Convention of States co-founder, said the following, quote, "The greatest thing we can achieve out of a convention is if they mess it up, again, we call another convention," end quote. A former U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania here today and national spokesman for Convention of States said last December in South Dakota, quote, "I really believe we need to institute the Article 5 Convention as a normal thing that the legislatures do, that every 5 or 10 years they have a convention," end quote. So why would the greatest achievement of a convention be to have a perpetual cycle of conventions? Not a balanced budget amendment, not term limits, or getting rid of the income tax. It's no specific change, just change. So those three subjects to which the convention would supposedly be limited are just bait to get legislators to agree to opening up a process of perpetual change to the supreme law of the land. And as the senator implied, these same folks will be back immediately lobbying for endless conventions. Did they mention that to you when they lobbied you? Now, second reason is, well, the changes Ferris has in mind are much more substantial than what most legislators would assume would be within the scope of the resolution. For example, did anyone here think of rewriting or abolishing the whole third article of the U.S. Constitution dealing with the federal judiciary would be germane to the language of this resolution? Well, why not? Because back in August of 2013 at the ALEC meeting, Mr. Ferris, COS co-founder, said, quote, "One thing I would do is I would make it like the European Court of Justice. We should have 50 Supreme Court justices, and they should be appointed by the state legislatures," end quote. He went on to say, quote, "If they, the Supreme Court, abuse it, we just keep calling so if the Supreme Court messes up, okay, let's abolish it."
Please
If they're
wrap up.
going, yes, sir. Ignore the Constitution, we abolish the Supreme Court and figure out some other way to settle disputes. In short, Ferris and other COS people have major, sweeping, and perpetual changes in mind, and in their words, not mine, expose them, or they expose themselves. Are legislators sure they want to go down that road now that the objectives are a bit more clear? I respectfully urge you to table SJ2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next opponent.
Next up, Mr. Chair, we have Mark Anderlich.
Hello, Mark. Go ahead and speak.
Sorry, I had mute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mark Anderlich, Anderlik, and I stand in opposition to Senate Joint Resolution 2. While I agree that the unfunded federal mandates are odious and that there are serious constitutional issues before the Republic, the sponsor of this bill has perhaps misunderstood the impacts of the so-called national debt and the prescription to constitutionally address the national debt through fiscal restraints on federal government. The so-called national debt is broadly the accumulated amounts of federal government spending and borrowing to fund that spending minus federal government revenue, which is mainly generated through taxation. If the federal government spends $6 trillion in a year but only collects $5 trillion in revenue, there's a deficit of $1 trillion. This sounds scary, but it is only half of the picture. While Congress directs where that money specifically goes to, it is the American public generally who is the recipient of that $6 trillion in spending. A more accurate portrayal of the national debt must include what we learn when we use simple double entry bookkeeping. While federal spending is a liability for the government, it is an asset for the American people. While federal taxes are an asset for the government, they are a liability for the American people. The federal national debt is currently $31 trillion. To eliminate this debt, the federal government will need to reduce spending and/or increase taxes by $31 trillion. In 2021, the gross domestic product of the U.S. economy was $25 trillion. In other words, to eliminate the national debt, it would require the federal government to cut spending and/or increase taxes amounting to more than the entire U.S. economy produced in 2021. Taking $31 trillion out of the economy is clearly an economic catastrophe. One might argue that the cost of borrowing money to support spending above revenue is living beyond our means. This is very true for state and local governments. You must have revenue to at least match spending. But this is not the case for the federal government. Why? Because the federal government is the sovereign issuer of money. It can and has done daily for decades create money for spending. And as the sovereign issuer of money, the federal government can never go broke. Never. The federal government, in the end, does not need to borrow any dollars to support its spending. It can create dollars at any time, whether it's wise to do or not. But they can. The federal government budget is most assuredly not the same as our household budgets. It's not like the state budget either. Only the federal government can issue money at will.
Please wrap up.
Sure, just one more paragraph. Therefore, this bill offers a wildly incorrect understanding of the national debt. If the prescription contained in this bill to cut federal spending is accomplished, it will mean economic ruin for vast parts of the U.S. economy. We absolutely do not need a balanced budget amendment. I urge you and this committee to vote no on SJR 2. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am available to answer questions.
Thank you. Next up.
Next up, Mr. Chair, we have Joanna Martin.
Joanna. You are muted. Ms. Martin, you are on mute still. Hello. Let's go to the next one and we can try to come back.
Sounds good, Mr. Chair. Next up, we have Robin Morrison.
Okay, Robin.
Chairman Small, Vice Chairman Nolan, Vice Chairman Curdy, and members of the committee. My name is Robin Morrison, spelled R-O-B-Y-N, M-O-R-R-I-S-O-N. I am here today to testify on behalf of the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization founded in 1920 to help new voters understand how to be an engaged citizen in government, including voting in elections and testifying before government committees. The League uses a process of research, study, discussion, and consensus that engages all of its members at the local level to arrive at positions on issues affecting government operations and policy. The League has used this process for over 60 years. In 2013 through 2015, the National League of Women Voters researched and conducted a study of Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution and what an Article 5 constitutional convention would look like. The League of Women Voters concluded that there are many unknowns involved in calls for an Article 5 constitutional convention. Research and consensus of the League members confirmed that this type of convention has never occurred. There are far too many concerns that it could result in a runaway convention that could rewrite any constitutional right or protection currently available to the United States citizens. Without a clear construct, a constitutional convention could throw the country into turmoil, creating legal and political battles of great consequence to the nation's future. The League of Women Voters opposes SJ2 and urges this committee to oppose it. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much. Can we go back to Joanna, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair, here she is.
You are still muted. Okay, we're either having bad technical, oh, there we go.
Oh, you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Please go.
Oh, thank you for your patience. Mr. Chairman, honorable members, I'm Joanna Martin, retired attorney in Tennessee, and speak for myself against SJ2. My written testimony contains an exhibit list with proof of what I'll say. Our Declaration of Independence recognizes that a people have the self-evident right to throw off one government and set up a new one. James Madison, a delegate to the Federal Convention of 1787, where our present Constitution was drafted, invoked this principle as justification for the delegates ignoring their instructions to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation and drafting a new Constitution which created a new government. And the new Constitution provided it would be ratified when only 9 of the 13 states approved it, whereas the Articles of Confederation required all of the states and the Congress to approve amendments to the Articles. But soon after our new Constitution was ratified, and even before the new government went into operation, the Anti-Federalists started pushing for an Article 5 convention. Patrick Henry got the Virginia legislature to pass an application for Congress to call a convention. This application was presented to Congress right after the new government went into operation. Now, John Jay, who became our first Chief Justice, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, understood the right of a people to throw off their government. So when they saw what the Anti-Federalists were up to, they started warning against an Article 5 convention. Please see the Brilliant Men flyer at item 13 on the exhibit list. You need to see what Hamilton really said. You've been getting misinformation. Item 5 on the exhibit list shows what George Mason really said. His concern was that Congress might refuse consent to amendments which were needed to correct defects in the Constitution. He never said what proponents claim. Item 5 also shows at footnote 3 that Madison warned that those who secretly wished to get a new Constitution would push for an Article 5 convention under the pretext of getting amendments. That's what's going on today. New constitutions are already prepared. They're linked on my exhibit list. The proposed Constitution for the new states of America is ratified by a national referendum. Under the North American Union, a Parliament is to be set up over Canada, the United States, and Mexico.
Please wrap up.
Thank you. The task force report sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations is on my exhibit list. Before they can move us into the North American Union, they need a new constitution which transforms us from a sovereign nation to a member state of the North American Union. And to get that new constitution, they need a convention. That's what this is all about. The National Constitution Center has a constitution project They have 3 proposed constitutions. They're on the exhibit list. The so-called conservative constitution was co-authored by Robert P. George, who is a member of Mark Meckler's COS Legal Advisory Board. It creates a new government and imposes gun controls.
Mr. Chairman,
with
I
red
object.
flag
That's
confiscation.
good enough. You're done. Lauren?
Okay, Mr. Chair, our final opponent will be Sean Meehan.
Okay, Sean.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. I'm Sean Meehan, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant, Desert Storm Operation, Iraqi Freedom Combat Zone veteran, and I founded Guard the Constitution 9 years ago this month to specifically focus on the Article 5 Convention issue. Article 5 is, in fact, in the Constitution, but in no way was it placed there for the reason the Convention of States claims. Mark Meckler and COS promoters distort Mason's words from the 1787 convention on September 15th. They say, quote, Colonel George Mason addresses the assembly and says, we have a problem. We gave the power to Congress to propose amendments, but not to the people acting through the states. And he asked a question. He said, are we so naive to believe that the government that becomes a tyranny will propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? Well, if you actually look at Madison's notes of the 1787 convention, the fraud will be revealed because we know what Mason actually said. He said, quote, as the proposing of amendments is in both the modes to depend in the first immediately and in the second ultimately on Congress. No amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained of the people if the government should become oppressive, as he verily believed would be the case. Tyranny mentioned nowhere. Alexander Hamilton said in convention September 10th, 1787, that amendments remedy defects in the Constitution. And George Mason himself in convention on June 11th, 1787, said the Constitution now being formed will certainly be defective as the correct the bill's sponsor for SJR2, he quoted Federalist 85 saying, quote, we may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority. But in the same Federalist 85, you read, it says, for my own part, I acknowledge a thorough conviction that any amendments which may, upon mature consideration, be thought useful, will be applicable to the organization of the government, here it comes, not the mass of its powers. A further clarifying point, Thomas Jefferson wrote to Archibald Stuart, December 23rd, 1791. He said, then it is important to strengthen the state governments. And as this cannot be done by any change in the federal constitution, it must be done by the states themselves, erecting such barriers at the constitutional line as cannot be surmounted either by themselves or the general government. Their only power is a wise government.
Please close.
I'm running out of time, so I'll just say a proponent said there was no historical convention running away. You need to look at the state of Pennsylvania, 1873 state convention. They exceeded their charter. The court said so. Please honor the sacrifice of nearly 1.4 million veterans that have given their lives in the history of this country and guard our Constitution. Happy to accept questions, Mr. Chairman, if it would assist the committee.
Okay, thank you. Does that conclude the online opponent?
That does, Mr. Chair.
Okay, do we have any informational witnesses in the room? Oh, you can't be both. You already spoke as a opponent, or I mean as a...
As an informational witness,
yeah, you can't double
it's
down.
just the terms that have been used here as money and
You
debt
cannot
and stuff.
double down.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have another informational witness? Do we have anybody online?
No informational witnesses online, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the committee? Senator Vermeer.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a question for Senator McGilvery.
Mr. Chair, Senator Vermeer.
Vermeer.
Thank you, Chairman. Senator, I've gotten a lot of emails and messages about opposition from the opposition that Congress will control the convention for proposing amendments. Do you see this as a problem, or what do you? How do you feel that the control of the convention would be?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, I don't think Congress will control the convention, and two reasons. One, you have to remember that the whole purpose of the Article 5 Convention for proposing amendments, according to Mason, both proponents and opponents said this, it was designed as a congressional bypass. Mason felt that at some point Congress would become oppressive. So they designed Article 5 with the convention to propose amendments, where the states would propose amendments to take Congress out of having control of both mechanisms. So the whole point of Article 5 was to give a different mechanism other than Congress. Secondly, courts have ruled, and you'll read this if you want to read Idaho versus Freeman, 1981, or Dry versus Blair, 1975. Both those cases and others indicate that Congress's Article 1 powers, in other words, their statutory powers, do not apply to Article 5. Article 5 powers are a federal function of the state legislatures and Congress, so all powers are delegated through Article 5, not Article 1. So, and again, I'd be happy to give you those cases if in your copious spare time you'd like to read them. But I can give you direct quotes right out of there that say that Article 1 powers, or Congress's necessary and proper powers, do not apply to Article 5. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions? Senator Dolan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'd like to ask maybe let's have former Senator Santorum, if he could come to the stand. Thank you, Senator, for being here. Mr. Chairman, the good Senator just addressed part of the process for control, but I was wondering if you could give me your enlightenment on how, if you say that people say that you cannot control the process.
Yeah, there's two elements to the issue of control. One is calling the convention. It's very clear, Article 5 says Congress shall call a convention. Once there are 34 petitions that meet the criteria of identical petitions or very, very similar petitions, it says Congress shall. It doesn't give them any discretion. That's number one. Number two is maybe more important, which is who's actually going to control the operation at the convention. Some have suggested that somehow Congress has some plan where they'll step in and they'll run the show. Believe it or not, Congress actually, there are members of Congress in the past who actually proposed such things. There were ideas put forward in the 1960s when there were a lot of these Convention of States Resolution, ERA, others that were being pushed by the states, and so Congress felt worried about it, so they several members proposed things to say, well, we're going to try to govern this process. They never got out of committee. There hasn't been one introduced in 40 or 50 years. There's no support. There's no, as the Senator McGilvery said, this was a process set up to bypass Congress. This was a process the founders who didn't trust the central government, didn't trust governors, executives. That's why the governors aren't involved, because they wanted the body closest to the people to have the final say, to be, as I said, at the top of the food chain. That's where the legislature actually is in the Constitution. That's what you were intended to be. The states were the sovereigns. They formed this country, but the states were the ones who were supposed to have the ultimate authority. The state legislatures in particular were the ones. As far as control of the convention itself, the state legislature controls. How do we know that? Because you can pass, as I'm sure you will, when this resolution, if it becomes a reality, you will pass a resolution or a statute, I don't know how you'll do it here in Montana, that will actually designate how you're going to appoint the commissioners to the convention. So you will decide that here in the legislature. You will have, I'll give you an example, your next door neighbor in Wyoming. Wyoming passed such a thing. They haven't passed a resolution, but they passed the statute that defines how delegates, or they're called commissioners, are appointed. And they have certain things that they have a sort of a faithful delegate provision. That if the legislature says, well, here are your constraints, and you can do that, the state legislature can pass constraints on the delegates as to what they can and can't vote for. And if in Wyoming, if you violate that provision, it's a felony subject to 5 years in prison and a hefty fine. So the point I'm trying to say here, you have the power to control this entire process with respect to your own memberships, and then collectively each state with respect to the convention as a whole. It is not the federal government. And having been in Washington, having served there for 16 years, they are not going to touch this hornet's nest. If 34 states finally come together and do this, that means there's a broad national support, and there are not a lot of courageous people in Washington, D.C. who are going to stand up to 34 state legislatures in a broad move across the public to try to mess with this.
Thank you. Follow-up?
Follow-up.
Senator Santorum, it was talked a little bit about nullification. Could you maybe address that and enlighten me on that a little bit further?
Well, we see calls on that, frankly, on both sides. You have this with, the sanctuary cities movement that, we're going to ignore federal law, we're not going to enforce federal law. My sense on that is that the idea of proposing nullification, that we fought that battle in the Civil War, and really haven't heard much from nullification since then, nor should we. We are a constitutional republic. We live by those constitutions. Not to say that, and going back to what members have said and holding up their constitution and saying this is the law of the land. We have a court that interprets the Constitution, and people say that we're not, we don't live by it or we're not adhering to it. The reality is we do adhere to it as interpreted by the Supreme Court. And if you look at the 27 amendments that have passed since the founding, what amendment haven't we lived by? Do we not live by the 17th Amendment? Are senators no longer popularly elected? Do we not have an income tax? Do we have prohibition, and was it repealed? I mean, if you look at every amendment, which amendment that has passed don't we live by? You could say the 10th Amendment, but and that's a battle. But it's not that the states don't have the right to go to court and fight the federal government. It happens all the time. So the idea that the amendment process, when you can get 38 state legislatures to come together and affirm that this is what a change we want in the Constitution, that is broad national consensus. You're not going to see the Congress or the courts anytime soon say, oh, well, we're just going to ignore that. It's just not the reality of how this would work in a republic.
Thank you.
Questions? Senator Curdy.
Yes, Mr. Chair, for Senator Santorum.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, Senator Santorum, so I have a question. So how are we going to, let's say, assign delegates per each state to this convention?
So the legislature here in Montana, just like they have done in other states that have passed this, will pass a legislation to say, for example, I mean, this could be something that the majority would pick 3 delegates. The minority in the Senate, for example, would pick 2, and then maybe in the House it would be the same thing. Majority pick 3, the minority would pick 2. They could do different ratios. I mean, it would be a debate and a discussion, but the legislature would pass either a resolution or a statute that would determine the composition of your commissioners.
Okay, follow up, Mr. Chair.
Follow.
Mr. Chair or Senator Santorum, so, most people, from what I read about the COS, they say that
the number of delegates each state will get should be pretty much conform to the number of electors for each state?
Well, there's a difference in number of commissioners of actually represent people who are in the delegation, and then the actual vote counted by the state. Every convention of state, pre and post Constitution, have always had every sovereign state is entitled to one vote. So the state of California gets one vote, the state of Montana gets one vote. Why? Because California is a sovereign entity and gets one vote. And who will make that decision? That will be decided in the rules that are put forth at the convention. And of course, if you think about it, the vast majority of the states at the convention are smaller states. There are only half a dozen or so really big states. And so the smaller states having the ability to impact the rules, because it's the historical thing is one state, one vote, one sovereign entity, each gets a vote. I think the chances of any change in the rules of how conventions are run is pretty low.
So follow up, Mr. Chair.
Follow.
So, Mr. Chair, Senator Santorum, so do you think the large states would go along with that arrangement?
They would be outvoted.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Santorum, how is that?
Again, just like when you gather a legislative session, you pass a set of rules. You probably did so recently. The United States Senate's a continuing body, so the Senate doesn't pass rules every year, but the Congress does. You saw that just enacted they couldn't pass a rules package until they had a speaker. So that would be the case here. The convention would be called just like a national convention would be called, and you have a rules committee. The rules committee comes together and they draft a set of rules, and those rules are then voted on by the members. And so that's how that process would take place.
Well,
so, Mr. Chair, Senator Santorum, so again, I can't follow your line of reasoning here, because most of what I read about the Convention of States and what Mr. Meckler and the rest have said is that basically most of the representation is based on the number of electors that each state has. And
I'm just looking at the history of Convention of States. Every Convention of States in the history of our country has gone by the fact that each state is entitled to one vote at the convention. I'll give you an example of something that most people are familiar with. The Colorado River Compact was a convention of states, and each state had one vote at that compact. And again, if you go up through history, that has been the norm.
So, what final, Mr. Chair, Senator. So again, this is not a convention of Colorado River Basin of states. Okay, this is a national convention. We've done it once. Did every state, every colony have one delegate to the convention?
We've never had an Article 5 convention. You said we've done it once.
My point is, we supposedly have, we've had a convention, one convention. Did we have just one vote for each colony or each state at that time?
At the Constitutional Convention, again, is different than a convention of states. So the answer is, at the Constitutional Convention, they had every state had delegates that were appointed, and they had different numbers. Yes, that's correct.
Well, Mr. Chair, we're not getting here because, again, nothing in what the Convention of States has said, the background information I see says it's not based on one delegate per state, I guess.
With all due respect, Senator,
what you're saying here doesn't conform to what I read about what folks who propose a convention state are saying.
Well, I work with Mark Meckler all the time, and I've heard him talk repeatedly, and I will tell you that he always says, as do I always say, because the reality is every convention of state that has been held has every sovereign state is entitled to one vote.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
thank you. Do we have Senator Pope?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to find this person who gave testimony, but it would be the last gentleman. I didn't catch the name.
Is it Sean Meehan?
I believe so.
Sean Meehan, you're online.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, I'm here.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Meehan, I think you made a comment that Article that Article 5 is not placed in the Constitution for the reasons offered. Would you take a minute or two just to sort of fill that in as to what you intended to say there? Thank you.
Yes, sir. This is the core foundation of the argument that Convention of States has made since their inception, and all of their luminaries still make it. They misquote what George Mason said September 15th, 1787. And I read what was said by Mark Meckler about 5 years ago on Fox and Friends TV station. And then I read from Madison's notes of the 1787 convention that codify what Mason actually said. And we agree that they were concerned that the states were not allowed to propose amendments, but the problem is the complete misunderstanding of the purpose of amendments. Amendments clearly described and talked about that they will not address the math powers, but they will address errors and defects. And as a country, state, and people, not properly using the Constitution is not a defect in the Constitution. It is a defect in we, the people. So that is why Article 5 was put in there, because there's always this straw man argument of Article 5 is in the Constitution, we have to use it to restrain tyranny. And I conclude the thought by saying it's a very simple example. If the speed limit is being exceeded, you don't raise the speed limit to get compliance. If your children are supposed to clean their room 2 days a week and they only clean it one, you don't change it to where they clean it one. You discipline and motivate them to clean it two. And finally, I think an important point to the fabric of our country is if your spouse cheats on you and violates your marriage vows, you get a counselor or a minister, family member, friend, or if it goes that far, you get a divorce. You don't amend your marriage vows. This is what they're trying to tell us, sir.
Mr. Chair, one follow-up.
Follow-up.
Thank you. Sir, would you care to comment on the conversation that was just had about, well, it has to do with whether Congress, if it sets up a constitutional convention, would be able to establish rules for that process versus whether what's being suggested here would have the ability to have sideboards, strict rules to that process.
Absolutely, sir. Happy to comment. An overriding theme that hasn't been talked about that we have to embrace here is the very fact that the Constitution that those of us that are against and my friends in the Convention of States that are in favor of this movement, we all love the Constitution. And if you look at Article 6 and you read the Supremacy Clause, as originally ratified, it says that it's the law of the land. We all respect and revere the Constitution. We find ourselves in this hearing right now. We find ourselves in this movement to amend the Constitution because the Constitution's not being followed. And it's in that context we have to behave and watch our legislative psychology and not talk about what's written, but talk about what's really going to happen. If the supreme law of the land is not being followed, which causes us to be here, we have to question whether rules will be followed or not. Now, having said that, with all due respect, Senator Santorum couldn't be more wrong in what he said about the rules and Congress in the past, and nothing's been done since then. In 1973, the United States Senate unanimously passed the 1973 Convention Act, passed the House, and it did not become law. But it was a strong codification of a movement towards Congress saying we have the authority, and it would be an electoral college weighted model. Again, when the Constitution itself is being disobeyed, past traditions of conventions and alleged one state, one vote are ridiculous. And Robert Nadelson, the attorney, your own Montanan there, has said one state, one vote, except when pressed at an ALEC convention, he said, but the final rules of suffrage are up to the convention. And if any of you have been at any kind of a political or legislative convention, they're not rules. They are draft rules until the gavel falls and then the convention as its own sovereign body amends those rules. So, and also it's been, the Congressional Research Service has established that at least 41 times over the years, Congress has offered bills to try to control a convention. This would ultimately end up in court. And then there's a question of what they call justiciability, whether the federal courts would want to touch it or not. In history, they have touched and ruled on some Article 5 issues, and they have refused to touch others. The only thing that is certain is the uncertainty of what the courts would do, sir.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Do we have any more questions from the committee? Senator Doan. Oh, Senator Sales, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It'd be for the sponsor.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Sales.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator McGilvery, I'm going back through my notes and listening to the discussion about the rules and how the convention may or may not be played out. But I guess I have a question. First, I'll just ask the question, and then we'll maybe have some follow-ups. But have any other states that have already passed a resolution pulled back and rescinded those resolutions?
Not to my knowledge, Mr. Chair, Senator.
Okay, and then a follow-up if I could.
Follow.
Okay, with that of your answer then, and I believe there may have been, but with your clarification on not knowing, can you explain to me how the process is if it's one intended item, or if we can now add additional, right, the term limits, the balanced budget? So if you could explain to me how that would be handled.
Let me, Mr. Chair, Senator, let me clarify my answer to your previous question. There have been states that have rescinded Article 5 applications. But my answer was, to my knowledge, there is no states that have rescinded the Convention of States application.
Okay. And thank you, that maybe I didn't state my question clear, but that's the answer. So then on that, how will those be handled by then the body when they look at trying to get the number and the clarification of whether some are single items or 3 items or more?
Well, Mr. Chair, Senator Sales, I'll try to answer your question this way. There have been about 400 historically Convention of States application. Most of those have been single subject applications, to my knowledge. The Convention of States application is 3 subjects, limited to 3 subjects: limit the power and jurisdiction, fiscal restraint, and term limit. So under that application, you can propose amendments under those 3 subjects.
If I could, thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator, then I believe I heard from one of the proponents that they must have identical amendments. So in the term identical,
yeah,
that's where I'm
Mr. Chair, Senator, the application should be identical. So the Convention of States application, the one I am proposing to this committee, is the identical application in all 19 states that have passed it. This application is identical to those 19 states. If they're not identical, then you would have a problem with what's called aggregation. So if you had applications that are somewhat similar but a little bit different, then you may have to fight the fight that those applications aggregate to 34 or 2/3. Because that is a concern, the Convention of States has made it abundantly clear and that we will try to pass identical applications in every state. So when we hit the 34, there's no question about aggregation.
So if I could just have one clarification for myself, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Then, so the way I understand it, Senator McGilvery, is those states that rescinded but then put in another resolution would be counted as a single resolution for that.
Yeah, if you rescind it, like I said earlier in my opening, if I'm understanding your question, and we could always get together offline too, I voted to rescind all Montana Article 5 applications back in 2007. So Montana has no outstanding Article 5 applications. So technically, one of those 19 states could rescind an Article 5 application, and I think you're seeing that in many states. The opposition tries to get them rescinded. Because once you get them rescinded, then you're down one. You've got to get to 34. Once 34 have made application, you can't, to my knowledge, rescind.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
Senator Nolan.
Thank you. Senator Santorum, again, please. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Senator, can Congress bypass what the states propose at a convention?
Can Congress bypass? I'm not sure I understand. So what states do at the convention is meet as a convention, propose amendments. Those amendments don't intersect with Congress at all. They, just like a congressionally passed proposed amendment, they immediately go to the state legislatures for ratification. So the Congress in no point in this process can interfere. And as was stated, the Congress has proposed and tried to do that again 50 years ago, but nothing has been, even to my knowledge, introduced, much less debated since. And I'm not suggesting that Congress won't want to try at some point, and may, if this movement continues to grow, which I believe it will, that Congress won't try to do something like to try to intersect itself, but that's an issue that we'll deal with at the time. I don't think there's much appetite. Congress doesn't pass a whole lot of things to begin with, much less sticking their nose in something like this.
Thank you. I have another question from Senator McGilvery.
Yep.
Mr. Chair, Senator Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if you could enlighten me a little bit further on that, it's been talk about a runaway. It hasn't been a lot of talk, but a little bit of talk about a runaway. Why don't you think that could happen?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator, for the question. In my study and my work, my confidence that a runaway is, for all practical purposes, impossible. And I'll give you two quick reasons. Number one, this application, and you read it, and make note, this clearly is a legal document under the authority of Article 5, an application for a convention to propose amendments. It clearly states multiple times it is limited. We all know as legislators that when we have proponents or sponsors come before committees to tell the intent of the legislation, if that legislation is ever questioned in the courts, the court is going to go back and look at the proponents and the sponsors. What did they say is the intent of the legislation? In this case, the courts would go back and say, if ever any amendment was passed that was beyond or ultra vires beyond the authority of that application, the courts would go back and say, what was the intent? They'd look at 34 state legislatures, 34 sponsors, thousands of proponents that said this is a limited application. And the courts would say, it's a limited application. It's very clear. Secondly, I do have a bill that's been brought up a couple times by Senator Santorum. Other states have passed it, that will clearly articulate how we choose our commissioners or delegates to that commission, to the convention. My bill has, for Montana, having 5 commissioners. So let's look at the practicality of that. Those commissioners will be given instruction. Those commissioners in other states have the same laws, are given an oath. And if they go beyond the instructions and their oath to stay within the limited application, they are subject to recall and fine. We know that the states can control their commissioners Because in Chavala versus Washington, which was a 2020 case, 2 rogue commissioners in Washington that tried to vote for Trump, that these are electoral college delegates, were recalled and fined. The states, we know, the courts have said the states can control their commissioners. The first commissioner to try to go out of line, propose an ultra vires amendment that's beyond the scope of the application, is recalled and fined. Lastly, Skidmore, Montana. You have 5 commissioners there from Montana. You'd have to get 3 of that delegation to change, to outvote the rest of the delegation to say, let's go ultra vires, let's go beyond our application. You'd have to get to them to say, we're breaking our oath, we're breaking our instructions, we're disobeying what 34 states have come here to do. It's a matter, it comes down to a matter of integrity there. And if you got those 3, you've got to have 34 other states. The idea that you're going to get that many people to disobey their instructions, break their oaths, subject themselves to recall, fine, and in some cases felony, goes beyond the pale.
Thank
I don't
you.
think that can happen.
Follow up?
Follow up.
Along these similar lines, in 2016, there was a simulated convention and considered a runaway. Would you like to address that? Help me understand that.
Yeah, I don't have time to address that in detail, but I would say that Professor Nadelson, you heard Joanne Martin's testimony today. She wrote a missive that suggested that the 2016 convention in Williamsburg, which is a simulated convention, it's online, a convention stage. You can watch it, how well it worked. You can listen to what amendments they proposed. I can give you the detailed amendments they proposed. None of those amendments went beyond the scope of that application. Professor Nadelson wrote a very good piece that addresses that, and I'd be happy to share it with anybody.
Thank you.
Senator Pope.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the sponsor. Mr. Chair, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Pope.
Thank you. This won't take long. You mentioned just a few minutes ago that this document really limits the scope. I'm going to read the text here at the bottom of page 1, Mr. Chair, if I might. Calling for a convention of the states limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution of the U.S. that impose, number 1, fiscal restraints on the federal government. Number 2, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And then limiting the terms of office for its officials and members. Mr. Chair, if I might, Senator, if we had a hearing in this body on any of those 3 items, much less the collective part of those 3 items, which defines a lot of the federal government's relation to the states, for example, you know, we would have 50 amendments on each one of these. I mean, can you explain how there's some discipline in the process that you're trying to suggest?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pope. That's an excellent question. I think you have to look at the practicality of a convention. First of all, by the way, there's been rules proposed for conventions in several sources I'd be happy to share with you, so we have rules already developed. 2017 Phoenix Planning Convention, which was the last convention of states, did propose rules for a convention. But how do you limit the scope of those amendments? So practically speaking, you're going to have committees, for example, on fiscal restraint. The Committee on Fiscal Restraint will come up with amendments. Those will go to the floor for vote. The simulated convention came up with 6 amendments. And you have to look at the practicality that you want a few amendments, 3, 4, 5, whatever it may be, in these areas. You've got to get those passed in 38 states. You have one shot here. So I think in many ways this comes down to the wisdom and the practicality of the convention to pass what is popular in the states. In other words, term limits. It's a very popular thing. You know you can get that one. Fiscal restraint. The Germans and the Swiss both put debt brakes in their constitution. Extremely popular, extremely effective. So you have to look at what can we get through 38 state legislators or 38 state conventions. And so in many ways it comes down to the wisdom of the convention to limit those amendments.
Mr. Chair, one follow-up.
Follow-up.
Senator, And you have confidence that given the wisdom of this future convention, of an assembly of folks who we don't know how they represent their people and numerically, we don't know who those folks are, we don't know how they're selected, and we have no idea what the subjects are in particular, you have confidence that there's wisdom and, you know, Senator, I know you to be a moral and upstanding person and a terrific representative of your constituents. How do you have the assurance in your heart that some future gathering of folks, whether they're chosen by their states or whatever the process is, and not knowing not one rule today that would govern this process, how do you have that comfort? Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you for the question. First of all, these are state legislators, so these people are much closer to the ground, the people. The people standing behind us today are desperately pleading for us to go there. So I believe that the state legislatures can much more effectively address the questions that are at hand than what's happening in Congress. We have, and I'll close with these remarks, I'll make it short. We have a Congress that's completely out of control and untrustworthy. We have to have faith that ultimately men and women who are given an oath, who take an oath to propose amendments for the salvation of this nation will do it right. Because, if you will, it's in a sense like our last resort. Madison said that. As a last resort, when you have no other options, and I'll quote that in my close, you have the process applicable to the state, use it. And so I have to say that I'm going to go with the framers, that they were wise enough, and that we are wise enough to do what is right and good for this nation.
Thank you, Senators. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any more questions from the committee? Seeing none, Senator, would you care to close?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of this committee for your indulgence and patience in this hearing. I know it's been long, and I want to thank both proponents and opponents. One thing I'm completely convinced of, everyone testifying before this committee today has one interest at heart, our great nation's survival. And we all see trends that are fatal to this representative republic. It's my conviction that the convention method is the best method that we can pursue right now to make an impact, to make change. As I said, Madison in 1830 said this in a letter to Edward Everett. You can search it online. He said, should the Constitution as herein reviewed prove not to secure the governments and rights of the states against abuses and usurpations by the national authority, he said, the final resort within the purview of the Constitution is an amendment to the Constitution according to the process applicable to the states. So you heard testimony that this was only to deal with defects. You can cherry pick the quote out of Federalist 43 where Madison said that, and he was right. It did address defects. But Madison also said that it addresses abuses and usurpations. Hamilton in 85 said it addresses encroachments. So whether it's a defect, an encroachment, oppression, abuse, sometimes we get messed up in semantics. We had one testimony said that Mason said it was abuse, oppression. The senator here said it was abuse, semantics. We all know the difference. Those are basically the same word. Let me just close by saying this. Us legislators here have federal functions as the Constitution gives us. Huck v. Smith, 1920, defined that there are certain functions in the Constitution that are given specifically to state legislators. Several of those are the Times, Places, and Manner Clause of Article 1, Section 4. It says the times, places, and manners of choosing senators and representatives shall be prescribed by the state legislators thereof. State legislatures thereof. HJ1 in the Congress this year tried to undercut our constitutional federal function to choose the times, places, and manners of choosing senators and representatives. Just recently in the 1.7 trillion Act, another undercut was Article 2, where it's the state legislators' federal function to decide how we choose delegates or electors to the Electoral College. In that bill, that took away that responsibility from us, our federal function, our duty, and gave it to the executive, whether it be Secretary of State or Governor, a direct undermining of our federal function. My point is that the Congress, or that the framers of our Constitution, gave state legislators certain federal functions to give check and balance to our government. In Article 5, it gave us a federal function, and that federal function is to push back on Congress. You heard all the fears that come about. Ultimately, you've got to put away fear and do your duty, just like I talked about with Uvalde or the city in Texas or Parkland in Florida. Those people who were given authority didn't take their duties seriously and didn't go in because of fear. SJ2 deals with fiscal restraint. We all know that the current financial situation of the United States is utterly shameful. It's on a dangerous and destructive path that will destroy our families, our freedom, our security in a hostile world. We need fiscal restraints. I'm not going to reiterate again the fiscal issues. We know 31.4 trillion, but no one has said that we're 277 trillion of unfunded liability. We have 12 trillion of guaranteed debt by the United States with Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac housing bonds. We're going 1.2 trillion in the hole on payroll taxes. In other words, Medicaid, Social Security, Medicare. Those payroll taxes are $1.1 trillion or $2 trillion short every year. You have a demographic of 50 million Americans that are over 65 now. It's going to go to 80 million. That's not sustainable. We also know that even under President Biden's budget, he expects 1.2 trillion or 1.1 trillion, I think, of interest on the debt by 2032. That's just interest on the debt. And that's before interest rates came up. So we are on an unsustainable path. And as much as my good friends who are opponents here, many of whom I deeply respect, are saying we just need to hold our Congress accountable, it's not working. We've been saying that since I was a little boy. Not working. We have to take action. We all understand the concept of federalism, that the powers not delegated by the Constitution to the United States or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. The concept of federalism under Article 10, or Amendment 10, was that we have certain reserved powers. Members of this body, of this legislature, it was our reserve power to deal with our water, our air, our coal, our oil, our gas, our pipelines, our forests, our timber, our education system, our police systems. Yet name one area of those where the federal government has not encroached in our affairs, and I believe it's time for us to put a stop by using our federal function under Article 5 to say enough, enough. Term limits, we keep hearing this, that we need term limits because we need experience in Congress. But let me ask this body, what has term limits gotten us? A balanced budget? Good tax policy? Good health care policy? A border? No. It's not gotten us any of those things. What we got is an entrenched bunch of dysfunctional, undisciplined congressmen who spend for their re-elections. No, we've gotten the opposite of that. We've gotten over 400 different agencies that control every minutia of our lives. You know, it's one thing to tell us what light bulb to screw into the socket. It's another thing to tell us what kind of medicine to take that could seriously jeopardize our lives and say, if you don't take that, you'll lose your job. For Washington to stop, we need to stop expecting Washington to change. Washington will not change because it's about power. It's about control. I said I would be hard on Washington, but Congress is about control. It's about control over you, your family, your money, the state's rights, every minutia of our lives. Remember, our founders did not fight a war against the British. They fought a war against big British centralized government. It's our obligation to bring back our government to a smaller government where the power is in the states. Democrat or Republican, we're all legislators here. All of us would want the power in our hands to delegate what happens with our coal, water, air, wildlife, wolf, grizzly bear, etc. We don't want that in Washington. That's why we're so divided as a nation. Reagan said this: Congress cannot discipline itself. We must rely on the states to force Congress to act on our amendment. This was a balanced budget amendment that he's talking about. Fortunately, the nation's founders gave us the means to amend the Constitution through the action of the state legislators. That is the only strategy that will work. Calls with a story. In my office, I have multiple monitors on my desk. One day I was working on this issue. On my right-hand monitor, I have the debt clock up. You all know what the debt clock is. Go to usdebtclock.com. And on the debt clock, you see these spinning red dials. It'll make you go bonkers if you watch it too long. Seriously. And one of my little grandsons, Harrison, who's 6, came and he said, "Papa, what's that?" I said, "That's the debt clock." Henry, who was 7, came in and said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, that's Congress spending more money than they have." And Harrison, who's 6, said, "Papa, why won't it stop?" Why won't it stop? We, members of this committee and members of this legislature, have a federal function, a sacred trust given by the framers. It is our duty, it is our hour to act. Let's stop it. It's in our hands. Thank you, members of the committee.
Thank you. And that concludes our hearing on Senate Joint Resolution 2.
Pretty good.
I liked it.
Pretty good. Sorry I had to object, but she wasn't on the bill.
And that concludes the hearing of the Montana Senate Committee on Business, Labor, and Economic Affairs. They just conducted a hearing on our Convention of States resolution, Senate Joint Resolution 2. And wow, what a hearing that was. It went on for over 3 hours. Senator Tom McGilvray did an incredible job introducing the resolution, responding to questions, closing. We heard testimony from Senator Rick Santorum, Senior Advisor for Convention of States Action. And what an amazing job our grassroots team did offering testimony. I'm Rita Peters, Senior Vice President for Legislative Affairs with Convention of States. And we have a treat for you because we have a couple of people ready to join and give their comments and thoughts at the hearing, starting with Regional Director Dave Schneider. Dave, welcome to the program. What's your reaction to that committee hearing?
I just got to say that was an amazing job by the grassroots. They showed up today in Helena, and just listening to the testimony, it was well thought out, well planned, and the grassroots are just absolutely on fire there in the state. And you heard it over and over again. The vast majority of Montanans want to do this. And it's time for the Montana legislature to stop listening to the very loud, vocal, small minority of few Montanans that have been resisting the Convention of States thus far. Everywhere I go in Montana, it's very clear that the Montanans really do support this effort. And it was very evident in the committee today. It's great to see the grassroots show up, provide testimony, and be very thoughtful in their testimony. It just contrasts that to what you saw from the opposition. It's the same old from the opposition, naysayers, and even out-of-state folks that were Skyping in or on video. Just more nonsense from, fear mongers. They have no solution in this whole process. And I always like to say the Convention of States is the force of positivity in America. And what you saw from the opposition today was just nothing but negative. No, we can't do this. No, we don't trust anybody. And no, we have no solutions. So Convention of States is absolutely the solution that's big enough to fix the problem that we have in Washington, D.C. Is it a solution to everything? No, absolutely not. And that's why we have the grassroots army, because that will be the solution to fixing things. And as we get through this process, that army is going to be very, very critical. And we keep growing in the state of Montana. It's looking so good. I'm looking forward to moving this bill out of that committee and moving closer to passage and getting another state on board. So, it was great to witness some of that great testimony today. They only meet every 2 years in Montana, so we've been a lot of pent up energy in Montana. So it was great to have my team there.
What an amazing job they did. And kudos to you, Dave, for training them and preparing them so well for this day. They were articulate, they were well prepared, they were respectful. Their points were just amazing. Question for you. So the hearing, I thought it went great, but we didn't see a vote. When do you expect this committee to vote?
Correct. Yeah, they're not, we're going to time that vote for when we wanted to move to the floor. So just because they didn't have a vote today is not a negative thing. We're in control of that process. We want to have the right timing to go to the floor. So with that being said, the guys on the ground are doing an amazing job and whipping those votes to ensure that we get the Senate to pass us on the floor vote. So that's really the big thing for us, is to make sure that we hit the floor ready to rock and roll with a victory out of the committee and a little momentum going to this.
That's right. Well, Dave,
yep.
Sorry, before we let you go, I know that the reason you were not in Montana today is because you are, even as we speak, in the Kansas legislature working behind the scenes at, I won't go into detail, but some procedural groundwork that needs to be laid so that we can get our resolution passed there in Kansas. And I hear things went the way we wanted them to go. Dave, you with us?
Sorry, Rita, I think I broke up there. I didn't quite catch your cat.
Oh, I was just pointing out that you were in Kansas today working on a procedural matter, and it looks like we lost Dave, but just so the audience knows, we've had a successful day today in Kansas as well, just working on some procedural matters for Convention of States and getting ready to file our resolution there as well. Okay, and Dave, I was just saying, sounded like things went pretty well for you today in Kansas. All right, Dave, thanks for being with us today. And thanks so much for the great work that you're doing. I don't know if you can see, but our audience is giving you all kinds of props for such an amazing job for you and your team. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a great time here in the state of Kansas. We actually have anybody here today. With the Rules Committee actually agreeing the House rules to favor our next big first year. And so now goes to the House floor probably next week for final passes and adoption rules. So it's a huge hurdle that we faced here in the state of Kansas, and looking forward to moving the ball forward here very soon.
All right. Keep up the good work, Dave. Thanks for joining us. And producer G, I understand that we were going to have Mark Meckler join us. I don't think we have him quite ready to go yet. So I'll just give a quick recap of what happened. This was our first committee hearing on our Convention of States resolution for 2023. We were in the Montana Senate Committee on Commerce, Business, Labor, and Economic Affairs, that is. And it was a great hearing. Senator Tom McGilvery, our Senate sponsor there in Montana, is a true Convention of States champion. He pointed out that he is behind this for the economic survival of America. He believes this is absolutely what's required to save the republic from economic ruin. And, I want to point out, Senator McGilvery said that it was a constituent of his who brought him on board with this whole effort, that he had actually been opposed and didn't really understand some things about the convention process, had a lot of concerns about it, but he sat down with a constituent who taught him about the process, pointed him to some resources to read and to educate himself. And because of the efforts of that constituent, just an ordinary citizen like you and me, Senator Tom McGilvery has become a champion for this movement in the state of Montana. So this is work for all of us to do. We Americans are self-governing citizens, and we have a duty to do, to be, doing our part, talking to our legislators, letting them know that we want them to do their duty, as Senator McGilvery pointed out so many times, and pass this Convention of States resolution to use their power under Article 5 of the Constitution to save our republic by correcting the federal abuses of power. And I think that's going to wrap it up. We heard a lot of testimony today. Oh, no, we have Mark Meckler. There you are. I was just about to give up hope. Mark, I know that you were watching that whole hearing, the wonderful parts of it, the painful parts of it, the ridiculous parts of it. What's your reaction?
I mean, the first thing I got to say is just kudos to the local team there, to the leadership, and frankly, to every single person who testified. That was one of the best I've ever seen. And I say this every year about a lot of different states, but what keeps happening is the bar keeps getting higher. And I remember when we first used to do this, people would get up there, they'd kind of say whatever they wanted, whatever was on their hearts. It wasn't always the most articulate, or their thoughts weren't necessarily well organized. They weren't rehearsed. People were saying the same things over and over again. What we're seeing now is the teams understand, and they've learned, act, learn, and adjust, that different people talk about different things, that everybody is well scripted. They've written out what they're going to say. They've rehearsed it with each other, so they all know how it all sort of plays off each other. Terry there was kind of the team commander on that and in charge of organizing everybody. Great job. Everybody I saw spoke. Literally every single proponent was excellent. And so the bar has just been reset higher than ever before. Of course, I love listening to Rick Santorum, and I just think he's as good as it gets when talking about Convention of States or almost anything as a public speaker. So what a privilege to have him there. Tom McGilvery, what an incredible sponsor, one of the top sponsors in the country, an articulate and passionate defender of Convention of States. So all of that stuff, super positive. I would add one more thing, which is I missed being there. I really missed it. Like, I was sitting here thinking, I just want to be there. But I also feel incredibly privileged that I don't have to be, that we have somebody as talented as Rick Santorum to be out there for us, that we have state teams that are so good at this, that we have a sponsor like Senator McGilvery, that we now have Mike Ferris who can be out in other legislatures. That means for me, I don't have to be everywhere. And that's super helpful. It makes my life a lot easier. I can be off doing other things. I was multitasking there. I was watching the Montana hearing at the same time the Kansas rules hearing came up. So I popped that open. I was handling some other stuff. What a privilege to have come this far in the organization where you have that much depth that I don't feel like I got to be everywhere like it was in the lean early days. And so kudos to the team, kudos to our sponsor, kudos to Santorum. And then the last thing I want to say is just what a mess our opponents are. And some of the personal attacks, like you heard from Sean Meehan, or just, and this whole thing about how I misquote Mason. I'm not trying to say Mason's words exactly. And they try to parse words. And you have Joanna Martin, who used to go by Publius Hulda, and her just craziness about some North American union. When you compare what our opponents say and the demeanor of our opponents, just the professionalism of our folks compared to the opponents, I mean, there's just literally no comparison. I don't believe that any of our opponents are going to convince anybody of anything because of their arrogance, their aggressiveness, their dishonesty, their unprofessionalism. But I would say I'll stand with any one of those Convention of States activists anywhere, any day, in any legislative hearing, and I'd be proud to do it.
Mark, I'll be right there with you, standing behind them. They made us proud today, and we are so grateful that they are doing the actual work of self-governing citizens. If you're watching our program today and you haven't gotten involved yet, you're still on the sidelines, get in this fight with us. Go to conventionofstates.com, click on that Take Action tab, sign our petition, which goes to your legislators. Don't sit on the sidelines. We need you in this fight for our republic. Mark, thanks so much for being with us. I'm going to leave it at that today. And everybody stay tuned, and we'll keep you posted on how the committee vote goes. I'm looking for great things, and we'll be doing more live streams like this for future committee hearings. Mark, thanks for being with us, and thanks everybody for watching.